People who just up and left one day and started a new life, what was your experience like? So, as someone who was shooting up $200 to $500 a day in Oxy before I quit around 10 years ago, you really have to do two things if you are really at the stage that you want to quit. The first is very hard, but unlike the first person staying around, the same people you're around usually does not work. So much of your kinship with those people revolving around drugs will make you want to do drugs even if you stop for a while. You have to just go no contact with them. It's the only way I found any success. The second one, which is also just as hard for some people, is you have to get help. Real help, like replacement treatment, Suboxone or methadone and therapy. You have to realize going in that the replacements are just as bad, but they do the one thing that's essential. They let you normalize your life and take away the seeking drugs all the time mentality. Without that, it's very hard for therapy to work through all of this stuff, simply because your mind isn't in a state that it can be worked on. It's constantly starving for something it sees as food now, and will not stop wanting more to approach where the addiction is coming from. Edit. For people asking how I afforded this, I sold them to afford it, and I didn't do that large of an amount for very long, about 6 months. The majority of my addiction was $40 to $80 a day. It was also just more of I was able to do that and it fell into my lap than it was that I actively earned it. I just found a much better connection than anyone else I knew. The people I hung out with were all girls or people who sold crap themselves, so it was easy to do once I had that. Story number 2. 3 years ago, I moved from London, UK to Alberta, Canada. Best decision of my life. London is a very lonely city, especially when you're introverted. I never made any real close friends, and it's so insanely expensive that even with a great job, I didn't have much money left to go out and enjoy life. And I lived in a small town, awful shared apartment where the only space to myself was probably 20 square feet of room or smaller. It is an amazing city, but it didn't work for me. Since being in Alberta, I've made some close friends and I met the love of my life. I finally have savings and a realistic prospect of buying a house one day. I live in a huge 2-bedroom apartment by myself. I live near the Rockies, so I do a good amount of hiking. I've been tubing and ice skating with friends. Pre-COVID, I started going to a new gym, and on the first session had people saying hi and hello. Probably could have been friends if COVID hadn't hit. Not to mention, it's so sunny. The cold is extreme, but I will never miss the gray and rain of England. I moved here with a 2-week Airbnb reservation, $5,000 to survive off of, and no real plan. No job prospects, just the knowledge I could book a flight home if needed. And somehow, it all ended up working out. Edit. I'm stupid and was tired when I wrote this, so I estimated the size of my room in London, then added instead of multiplying. The room was probably more like 70 square feet. I came here through IEC, which is a reciprocal working holiday program for young people that many countries participate in. The US doesn't participate. This post was very black and white. London is really amazing, by the way. I had a lot of great times there, and I do miss a lot, but ultimately it wasn't for me. Alberta has its issues, same as everywhere else, and the economy is really struggling with the oil stuff. Canada isn't some utopia. I have happened to make a good life for myself here, and I personally love it though. But no hate on the UK, it'll always be my home, and I really miss roundabouts. Story number 3. I did this 3 months back. Shifted from Delhi, my hometown where I lived with my parents and brother, to Bangalore. I had been depressed for the last 3 years, worked in a very unsatisfactory job, and did almost no work. Then in March this year, I had a manic episode of bipolar where I spent all of my savings on useless stuff, almost got married to a woman I barely knew, and quit my job. I was jobless with no money and having panic attacks every day, remembering the crap I did and said when I was manic. And also thanks to COVID, every problem became 10x. I was wanting to take my own life most of the time, and months later I did get a job, but the pay was meager. And then one fine day, 8 months later, I fought with my brother, and I had had enough. So later that night, I packed some of my stuff and booked my flight to Bangalore and quit my job. And after 2 months of struggle, I got a new job with almost 3 times the income. Rented my own 2 BHK flat all for myself, threw all my old clothes and got new ones, started 3 other things, started learning boxing and lots more. All my friends live nearby, and best of all, I live in the best area probably in all of India. Everything is so much better that sometimes I think it's all in my head, and I'm actually in a coma from attempting to take my own life. Tell me this is real. I don't know how it will work for others, but I think it is worth a shot. Edit. Thanks for all of the love, it really made my day. And there was a lot of concern of this being a sign of me being manic again. Some people with bipolar or people who know someone with bipolar are asking me how I know this is not mania. These are the steps I'm taking and hopefully it helps someone. First, I have a 12-point scale that I rate myself every day on. 0 is utterly wanting to take my own life, 1 to 2 is dark depression, 3 is mild depression, 4 is low mood, 5 to 6 is stable, 7 to 8 is high energy, caution, 9 to 10 is hypomania, and 11 to 12 is paranoid mania. Then when I came to Bangalore on an impulse, I was 4, then 5 to 6, and hovered at 7 to 8, and sometimes 9. Continuing, I take regular therapy sessions at least 4 times a month from a clinical psychologist trained in dealing with bipolar. She regularly assesses and checks for sign of mania and depression. Then, whenever I reach 8 to 9 on that 12-point scale, I contact my psychiatrist to make sure I don't climb any higher. He prescribes me an anti-mania drug as an SOS, and he initially told me to take it every day, but that drug is effing up my emotions and energy, so I tightly monitor my mood and take it as an SOS in consultation with him. Then I have an impulse control rule. Whenever something sounds impulsive or too good, I first talk about it with friends and family to check if I am not crazy again. Then set a time duration after which I can act on the impulse. Continuing, I am prescribed one med and I take that every day without fail whatsoever happens. Also, I refrain from drugs. I always wanted to try LSD and other stuff, but I won't ever because that instantly triggers mania in a lot of people. And I am trying my best not to go into manic or depression again. Let's hope it works. Best of luck to all bipolar people out there, and much love. There is a silver lining, trust me. Story number 4. I'm often surprised that I actually fit into this category. I was in my 20s living at home, and honestly, I wanted to move out so badly, but my mom was really attached to me and panicked whenever I said I was going to move out, even though I have 3 siblings, one older, 2 younger, who had already moved out. Hey, it's not easy being the favorite child, but I was seeing that although I had a good job, my social life was garbage. I'd come home, eat and play computer games. I had a few close female friends, but come on, I'm living at home with my parents. Plus, I was shy and embarrassed of the living at home thing, so relationships never went where I wanted them. Then I was chatting with a high school friend in another country, and for kicks, I flew out to see him. Then I got a job at the company he worked at, so I decided, well, I'll go for a few months or so and see if I like it. Then one close coworker said simply to me, "If you don't go, you'll always regret not going. If you go and you don't like it, just come back." Which made perfect sense to me. Plus, coming home and finding an apartment instead of moving back home was an out to get out from under mom's apron strings. And hey, she has 3 other kids. So I went, and almost immediately I met several women, and being confident that I was an actual adult with my own place, I didn't have any problem convincing them I was good boyfriend material. I moved jobs and felt good about being a grown-up. Eventually bought a house, got married, had kids. We go home every year now. It used to be only at Christmas, but then it was twice a year so my kids could know their cousins and relatives. So I will always have 2 homes and 2 hometowns now. It was such a hard decision for me to go, and it was almost spur of the moment. 2,500 miles from home. I often wonder where I would be in life if I hadn't gone. I mean, if I had just sacked up and moved out, would I have changed in the same way? I don't know, but I had to try it. And I'm so thankful for that friend who told me, if you don't go, you'll always regret it. But if you go and you don't like it, you can always come back. Because he was 100% right. Story number 5. 3 years ago, USA to Japan. Got a visa through a teaching company, but they completely changed plans on me as soon as I arrived. I told them that I was assured before leaving that I would be living in a particular place and would not be happy in place B. I politely declined, took all of my money, about $3,000, and went about searching for something else. After blowing almost all of my money, I eventually met someone amazing who helped me get in the right direction. Eventually, I was offered a job after many applications and interviews, but didn't even have a place to live, was living in a capsule hotel. And after securing the job, I spent the rest of my money and maxed out my credit card on an apartment. It was a gamble, but I never had failure in mind. I spent the first month sleeping on my clothes until I had enough for a futon, then a bed. That amazing person who helped me and encouraged me to keep searching never stopped either, and is now my beautiful pregnant wife. I don't think I can win the lottery again. Story number 6. If you're in a rut and have the chance to start fresh somewhere with a better job and lifestyle, then just do it. Modern transport and telecommunications mean that keeping in touch with friends and family is easier than ever. I took a chance on myself and moved from a crappy place in the UK to Central Europe 12 years ago, and it completely transformed my life in almost every meaningful way. I went from really strongly disliking the place I live in and the kind of people I had contact with to now living in what for me is a paradise, working in stimulating and increasingly well-paid jobs, and surrounded mostly by positive and intellectual people. Also, my quality of life is just awesome and my health and fitness is now really good. I still haven't met my soulmate or life partner, but I have no idea if that person even exists. And at least I have some good along the way with some great and memorable people. Lord knows what I would have been doing with my life if I hadn't taken that chance. Probably in some uninspiring job in an uninspiring place, dreaming about how my life could have been different if only I had more balls. Life is short, so take what opportunities you can to make it better. Story number 7. I've done it 4 times now. Once involved immigrating to a new country, I've always made housing arrangements before I go, and once I did have a job lined up. The older I get, the easiest it gets. I definitely prefer solitude, so the first chunk of time in a new place is lovely. Being alone and completely free, doing what I want and answering to nobody. I've learned to take my time making friends and getting involved in my community. This last move at the beginning of the pandemic really changed my whole life. I've walked away from my career and my community work. I'm starting a business. I've made friends with people I really appreciate instead of making friends with people because of work and community networking needs. Each move has led to massive changes in who I am and how I live, what my priorities are, and this is a very good thing. This latest move in the pandemic really forced me to slow down and listen to what I need and who I am. That's the best part of picking up and leaving. You only have yourself. It's effing magic. The worst part is the time it takes to make friends. Sometimes you just want to go for a beer and chat. It can get a little lonely. Phone calls and video chats just aren't the same, but soon enough, friends will come along. Enjoy the alone time while you've got it. It's good to get out in the world and experience a different life, to see things from a different vantage point. It's good to learn that you can trust and rely on yourself, to see your strength and your weaknesses, your bravery. And honestly, we've only got one life. If wherever you go sucks, pick up and do it again. Go where you need to be happy. Your happiness has value, but don't forget, wherever you go, there you are. Moving isn't a magic trick that'll cure all that ails you. You still have to do the work to overcome whatever is going on that's making you want to run. It might just be a little easier when you have a clean slate. So I really appreciate this story shining a light on some of possibly the negative things you may experience, like loneliness can be a bit too much sometimes. Sometimes you just want to go out and enjoy yourself, but you got nobody. So part of that process is finding new people. And also, I'm really stupid because OP said, remember, wherever you go, there you are, which I thought was a quote from the Brady Bunch movie from 1995, but apparently it's a book made in 1994. So I'm a fool, I'm an idiot, okay? And wisdom I got from Mike Brady of the Brady Bunch movie. Those movies were so weird. There was incest in the second one. Let's continue. Story number 8. My ex and I packed up everything we could in our Jeep, plus our dogs, and left Florida for Maine. It went like, hey, I hate it here, don't you? Let's move far, far away. And one side trip visit to my parents later, and about 35 hours of drive time, we arrived to coastal Maine. Shortly after, the ex and I broke up, and life got really difficult and lonely. I was in the middle of a crisis and culture shock, having moved from Miami to small-town Maine. I didn't have a single soul here. I bounced around a few jobs, and some days I would go home and cry on my dogs because I was just so alone. I asked myself daily if this was the right decision. One day, I decided I didn't want to be sad anymore. I'd gotten over the ex and got a new job. The job sucked, but there I met my now closest and best girlfriends. I started to save a little. I found a nice house with a big yard to rent. I got new furniture. April will be 6 years I am here, and though I have struggled for about a year and doubted my decision, sometimes hourly, moving was by far the absolute best thing I could have ever done for myself. I left some toxic family, some less than ideal friends, and a state that I hate. Now my winters are spent playing in the snow with my dogs, and summers, pre-COVID of course, are spent working hard and having fun with my friends. I have a job I love now, and I'm glad I stuck to my decision, despite the struggles I had. Story number 9. Overall, it's been good. I-40F have done this a few times now. The last time was spring of 2018. I had a very uncomfortable 2 weeks with some random elderly couple I met off of Craigslist that I could have done without. They offered me a free room and board in exchange for help around the house and to be a friend to the wife when the husband worked out of town. But when I got there, they turned out to be nudist swingers who wanted me to join them. That was not happening. So I left and wandered to another state. I've been here for 2 years by myself, happy. I got a job that I enjoy. I keep to myself mostly. It's been good. I had cut all ties with my extended family decades ago, and my husband died in 2016, so there isn't anything or anyone tying me to any particular place. While I make friends easily, I don't maintain friendships by choice, so walking away and starting over isn't a big deal to me. I like the change of scenery. I like discovering new places and developing a routine full of my new favorite restaurants or parks and grocery stores, being a regular in a neighborhood gas station, then poof, I'm gone. On to the next place. When I moved into my current place, I could recall 34 places I've lived in my lifetime. Story number 10. In the year 2000, I was starting to become severely depressed and heading towards taking my own life. I was living in crappy surroundings in a town outside of Philadelphia. I kept needing an answer out of things instead of the permanent way, and the worse things got, the more I wanted to flee. I had no ties there anyway, so I moved to San Francisco. I drove there, alone across the country. My mother and grandparents were totally understanding. We were all a family of nomads anyway, living different places my entire life, so it was not super scary for me to start over again somewhere else. I went from the abrasive, dour, unfriendly East Coast to a city where people told me I was beautiful on a near daily basis. This is coming from an overweight chick who was always made fun of for it. It took me about 6 months to believe it. San Francisco was amazing for the self-esteem and confidence that I didn't have much of. People started conversation with me and treated me well, and you could truly be who you were without judgment. I had been thinking about moving back lately. However, I understand it's a completely different city now, unfortunately. I stayed there for about a year and then moved to New Mexico and have been here since. Save for a 5-year stint from 2007 to 2012 in North Carolina, where I had planned on going to college, which didn't work out. That was a terrible decision all around. But I love it here in my quiet small town. But I wouldn't trade that year in San Francisco for anything, because I learned so much about myself. And again, it was a wonderful place for my self-esteem. So I have to say I relate to OP's story here in an overlapping but different way. But when I first moved out of my parents' place, I was still in the same state. I wasn't terribly far away. If I needed help, my family was there. But I was alone. I didn't have a roommate or anything like that. And I learned so much about myself. I just had room to grow, spread my wings, and improve. And even though it was a little bit expensive, I don't regret it because I love the person who came out of that apartment. So I'm very happy that OP had a similar experience. But let me tell you, a new me was born inside of those 4 expensive, overpriced walls. But I love that new me, and I would not trade it for anything. And my ass looks so much better now. Anyway, next story. Story number 12. Obligatory, this isn't about me, but when my mom was younger and first moved to America, she had a roommate that did this. When she knew him, he was this chill, funny, laid-back stoner guy. They were also both fairly poor. But apparently this guy came from a super rich family. He used to be this preppy academic guy. He was in this fraternity at the huge state university he went to, and that fraternity sold tons of coke. And eventually, the police got a tip that the frat was dealing coke, and they came to search it. The problem was the warrant the police had did not permit them to go in the personal bedrooms in the frat. So, after finding nothing, they left to get a warrant to search more thoroughly. This was fortunate because right behind those doors, coke was being packaged and weighed and whatnot. Anyways, as soon as the police leave, the roommate packs a small bag and just effing leaves. He just walks out and leaves his whole preppy life behind. He didn't talk to anyone there. He didn't finish school there. As far as those people know, he disappeared. That's the story of my mom's former roommate. He also did some other stuff, but that's not relevant. Story number 13. I've actually done this several times in life, and I hope I can give you a little more perspective than someone who just did it once. As a young man, I would do this whenever I got a wild hair up my ass. I would pack a bag, which basically consisted of everything I owned, and I would hit the road. When I got somewhere I liked, I basically would couch surf until I got on my feet, and it was that simple. It's easy like that when you're young. Have few attachments, few possessions, few responsibilities, and the world is your oyster. If that sounds like you, then by all means, you have your whole life ahead of you, so try it and see what happens. It's a lot easier to recover from a mistake when you're young. Then I tried to do the same thing when I was 35. It turned out to be a lot harder than I remembered. For one thing, I'm not as comfortable with couch surfing as I was 15 years earlier. I can't just be a bum anymore. I tried falling back on savings, but then I was kicking myself when all of my savings dried up in less than 3 months. I didn't make the move with a job or apartment lined up because I thought it would be fast and easy to find a job. but times are changing and the market is different. It took about 2 months to get a job and 3 to find a place. Even then, both the job and home were really crappy temporary situations that I accepted out of desperation. In the end, it took me several years to recover. It wasn't nearly as easy as I remember it from my 18 to 25 years. And if I'm going to move now, I will absolutely make sure that I have all of my ducks in a row before taking the plunge. Story number 14. I lived in Arizona through high school, college, and after so, I had grown roots there. Nice condo, decent paying job, which I enjoyed, had solid friends, family lived up the street, and I was part of a co-ed soccer league. My days consisted of getting my morning cup of coffee, work out, go to work, come home, then play soccer, draw on my iPad, or play video games with my roommates. One day, as me and my roommates were working out, I had a sudden urge to join the military. Never wanted to before this moment. And the next day, I went straight to the recruiter's office and said I want to join the Navy. And 2 weeks later, I was sworn in and was leaving for boot camp the week thereafter. I sold my condo to my roommate, broke the lease of my car, tied all loose ends, kissed my family goodbye, and said see you later to my friends. I'm now in the Navy and got my orders for San Diego for my schooling, then Japan shortly after that. I am effing happy, and there's new challenges every day. Funny part, the only ones who reached out to me is my family. Friends didn't say congrats or nothing. Good riddance. I'm gonna live my life and have fun doing what I want to do on my terms. Story number 15. It's not quite up and left. I was living with my girlfriend for a year, and in that year, she had quit her old job, finished a 2-year business degree, and couldn't get anything good with it. She hated the office assistant/secretary type jobs and got a sleazy vibe from her bosses. My girlfriend was cute as hell and people liked having her as eye candy. What they didn't know is that she had 3 kids who lived with their dad, not me. She was in constant war with everyone in her family, tragic history, and was sick of their attempts to interfere in her decisions. Me, I was low-key with a low-key job, but the two of us were great together. My job became dead-end after a year of admin merry-go-round stuff, and the future was uncertain, but a big axe was a strong possibility. I had my eye on living in Tempe/Scottsdale for over 10 years, and had been there on vacation, read the Sunday paper for over a year to get familiar with the landscape, and I just wanted to bask in the extreme heat. She agreed to make a go of it with me. So it wasn't a random overnight thing at all. Plus, my brother lived down there, so that was a plus too. Took me a good month to get working, and I bounced between 3 different jobs before finding something decent, and I was glad to be there. She was okay for a couple of months, then freaked out being away from family. She got more unstable over the course of a year and then just ran off. Told me about a week ahead of time, so it wasn't a where'd she go kind of thing. By that time, I was in trade school, and that worked out well. Got a great job afterwards and a good career for 12 years, had lots of fun, and basically achieved 9 out of the 10 goals I had in mind when we first came down. The last one was outlandish and failed, then the bottom fell out on me and I've been in ruins the last 5 years. But at least I have a place to sleep and I ain't starving. And I got Wi-Fi. I'm so glad I took that chance and made the move. Life is an adventure. Story number 16. When I was 23, I moved from Connecticut to Washington. I was in a band that was doing okay and managing restaurants at the time. I grew up super poor, and even though I'd had an apartment with my girlfriend, I had very little. Like, I lived there for a year and never had a couch, no car, not even a license. I couldn't afford a vehicle, so why spend the money on acquiring my license? I had a 91-year-old grandfather in Washington, and he wanted to stay independent and live in his home, but he needed help. I hadn't seen him since I was 13, and had only spoken to him a handful of times since then, but he offered me the opportunity to live with him. I wouldn't have to pay anything, plus he had an extra car I could use, so I did it. My girlfriend and I packed up what little we owned into her car and drove across the country to live with my grandfather in a small retirement town. Aside from my girlfriend, he was the only person I knew for 3,000 miles. I got a job working in a restaurant in about 3 weeks. My girlfriend dropped me off until I got my license, which didn't take long. Then I saw on the news that a government agency had a critical staffing shortage, so I decided I'd put in for that opportunity, and ended up being selected. I ended up working 45 minutes south of home with odd hours. My girlfriend worked up north. We developed different social circles and split up 6 months after moving. My grandfather passed away about 6 months later. I was alone and homesick. I looked at avenues to move back to Connecticut, but I had a stable job and made a livable wage for the first time in my life, so I didn't want to go back to nothing. I ended up getting an apartment in a bigger city, and I've now worked for that agency for 14 years. I have lifelong friends, I'm married, I have kids, and I'm a homeowner. Coming from absolute poverty, I'm pretty proud of what I've accomplished. Story number 17. Moved all of my furniture onto my lawns and had a yard sale, including my car. I bought a ticket to Hawaii/Maui, and I knew one person there, and not well. I wasn't expecting it, but he picked me up from the airport and took me home. I told him I didn't want to stay for more than a few days, but I went and got a job down on Front Street waiting tables, and after about the third day, I cleaned up the house really well before work, and afterwards we camped out on the beach. Eventually made friends with a dude named Angel who went by Mud. We played some music together by the beach. He introduced me to the pack of homeless beach goons all around my age. Fell in with them pretty easily. Everyone took care of each other, food was shared, and people who had cars packed them full. Then the first friend called me over and asked me when I was coming back. I told him I'd come over and help make dinner. And over dinner, him and his roommates all told me that I had an open door policy at their house because I was respectful and clean, which is still my biggest takeaway for when traveling. Life pro tip, clean people's kitchens and living rooms when they aren't looking, and you'll always be welcome back. Still, I decided not to wear out my welcome and only stayed maybe 3 days out of the week. I rolled around with the goons. Sometimes we would spend all day busking for cash. Sometimes we'd go to the east side of the island and explore the jungle. I saw every bit of the island, slept on every shore, surfed everything but Jaws. I'm very amateur and it scared me. Jumped off of waterfalls, worked on a fruit farm, had a traditional luau, got shibari'd to the rainbow eucalyptus, ran from a wild pig, kicked some coral and almost died from staph, DJ'd NYE on the beach. Most nights I slept on the beach, others at the house, but on more than one occasion, I ended up in multi-million-dollar houses and condos for the night. Some of the gaudiest decorating I've ever seen. Interactions with the native, not local white people, are ultimately what made me want to leave. Not because of the reverse racism I was warned about by white people, but because they were so kind and respectful, despite the fact that most of their aunties and uncles had been pushed to tiny corners of the island. It ultimately felt like trespassing, and so I headed back to mainland, unsure of my destination. So I traveled through California, went vagrant style around Venice Beach, hitched a ride to SFB, then ride-shared my way up and stayed in Humboldt for a few weeks in a music studio before catching a ride east. Planned on getting all the way back to North Carolina, but then landed in Colorado, where I knew a lot of people. Got blizzarded in as soon as I arrived, so I started thinking about work, and I ended up getting a job and a nice spot in Denver, and I've been here for 2 years plus now. I have a lot more friends now, a lot more confidence in my ability to survive in the world, and a lot better perspective of who was my friend and who I just happened to know. All in all, I highly recommend everyone do this once in their life. I've seen so many people try and plan their move to perfection only to never do it. But be as ready for the hardships as the adventures, because they're truly inseparable in my eyes. Story number 18. I moved from Mexico to the UK, and it has been an amazing decision. I was already living in a flat with all furniture and stuff in Mexico City when a breaking point idea came to my mind. Just for some context, my sister was already living in the UK, and she said to me in the past that she could recommend me at her job to start working there. I spoke to my wife and mentioned this all to her, and it was difficult for both, but it was more difficult for her because her families are extremely closed, and the first nephew had been born. My parents gave me the money to buy a non-return ticket from Mexico, Toronto, UK, which took off the second week of January 2019. Pretty much, I had 6 months to save money, sell furniture and stuff, and find a job. Luckily, a company contacted me and offered me a job in Southwest England. Just 1 week before my leaving date, we got married, so my wife could apply for the spouse visa 6 months after. The flight from Mexico to the UK was very trying because I waited in Toronto airport for 18 hours. It was snowing heavily, and I preferred to stay in the airport. I slept on the waiting chairs for around 10 hours until the flight was just about to take off. I brought 2 big cases, my laptop and my PS4, my third best decision, and I lived in a spare room on the back garden in the house of one of my coworkers. After 9 months, my wife arrived to the UK, so we started our journey again. We moved into a different flat. I got a job as an AP, which it was very challenging and stressful. Not for the job itself, but my first manager harassed me and made awful comments about me. Some of the comments being racist. And I'm just about to change my job again, looking to start from scratch with my new career. And although I miss my family, this has been an amazing journey. And to be honest, many things in our life have improved. And of course, it has not been easy, and I just made a brief resume of all the things that we have gone through. Story number 19. This may be not exactly the type of situation OP is asking about. At least it wasn't the first thing that came to my mind, but looking at other responses, I guess it's relevant. In 2010, I was offered a 4-month contract in Finland in a field I never dreamed I would work in. At the time, time, I had steady employment in Michigan, but not a lot of prospects to do something I really loved. I tried to see if I could get 4 months leave from my job, but understandably, as it was during the busiest time of our year, it was denied. I thought about it for another day or two and decided to throw caution to the wind and take a chance on this opportunity halfway around the world, knowing full well that when I returned, I would have no job, no immediate prospects, and no place to live. I didn't want to keep paying for an empty apartment while I was gone. Well, that initial 4-month contract ended up getting extended a few times and eventually turned into a permanent one. I spent almost 10 years with that company, and I'm now at my second job in Helsinki, Finland. I'm married and have a 1.5-year-old son. I haven't been back to the States since 2019, and that was for work. I haven't been back just to visit since 2013. As others have said, taking that chance was the best choice I have ever made. Not only am I far happier than I've ever been, but I'm now a veteran in a field I never dreamed I could join. I've experienced more in the last 10 years than I did in 30 plus living stateside, and it's opened my eyes to so much that we can be blind to living in the bubble of the United States. I love where I came from and my friends and family who are there, but honestly, I have zero desire to go back there to live. Story number 20. On May 19th, 2013, I moved from Baton Rouge, Louisiana to Bend, Oregon to completely change careers. I'd worked in IT for about 10 years at that point and was running a technical department at Electronic Arts' North American Testing Center. That company is monstrous, and I'm so glad I left. I packed up everything I could fit in my old '94 Blazer and crossed the country heading west. What a trip it was. I hate driving east/west through Texas, though, so I opted to go north to the Ozarks first, get a nice night of camping in there in the mountains, and then headed west. But I woke up that next morning to a phone call from a concerned family member informing me that there were effing tornadoes headed my way. I checked the weather, and sure enough, there was a massive storm cell moving west to east in a band that stretched southwest-northeast, and it was dropping tornadoes everywhere. And it was barreling right into the path I was planning to drive west on I-40 through Oklahoma. The shape of the storm cell and its path made it utterly unavoidable without going south back down to I-10. F that noise. I got on I-40 and told myself I'm gonna make it or I won't. And this would prove to be one of the most stressful drives I have ever taken in my life. As I'm driving west into Oklahoma, the news on the radio of the tornadoes touching down all over the places seemed constant. Outside an hour of OKC, the radio announces that an F5 tornado has been reported heading right at the city. So, now seems like a good time to stop for gas, yeah? Yeah. So, I stopped and the station I pulled up to was packed with emergency response vehicles. This appeared to be their staging area while they waited for the storm to move through the city. Well, if they're not ready to move west yet, neither was I. So I filled up and got some coffee and sat down inside at a table to watch the news. After a bit, they showed footage of the tornado and it was massive, wreaking havoc. And as I watched, they switched to live footage of it. Then, in that live footage, it dissipated. I ran to my Blazer and sped towards through the city, glued to the radio listening for any other tornado reports, and they just kept coming in. And seemingly from around the exits, I kept passing on my way into the city. When I got inside to the city limits proper, it was like a hell scene. Cars wrapped around trees and suspended inside billboards. I was close to doing 90 miles per hour because every police officer I passed was waving me on with the utmost urgency. The cell wasn't done yet, though, and they were expecting another one to drop any minute. So I just drove as fast as I could to justify white-knuckling it all the way to Armadillo. As I crossed into the Texas Panhandle, it was like a curtain had been pulled back, and there was the sky again. The rest of the trip to Oregon was pretty uneventful compared to that. I made it to Oregon and met up with a friend that I had met a few years prior in Costa Rica. He had lured me to the PNW with tales of wildland firefighting and how much he had loved it, so I was going to give it a try. I will be going into my 9th fire season this summer, my 4th with the U.S. Forest Service, and I'm on a career path that I love. I get to travel a lot for work and spend lots of time outside in the course of my duties. At EA, I was making just under $30K a year running a freaking department, and they were hemming and hawing at me about a raise to something adequate for my workload. I wanted $20 an hour for running my team. Last year, I worked from May to November, and after unemployment is added in, I made over $60K with all of my overtime. Best decision I've ever made for myself, and I wish I had done it sooner. If I had started this career when I was 20 instead of 30, I'd be sitting as a captain or management officer right now, raking in GS8 pay. But even starting with the USFS at 35, I'll still get to retire early. This past December, I went back to Costa Rica and bought 2.5 acres of second growth rainforest from the same friend that got me into the fire in the first place. And now I have my winter project for the next 22 years until I retire. So, EA is such a bad, awful, terrible company that this guy said, you know what, I'm gonna move and become a firefighter and drive through tornadoes. That is how awful EA is, that you would probably rather risk your life than be anywhere in the vicinity of anything they put out. Why did they kill Anthem? I liked that game. Anyway, next story. Story number 21. I was only 23 at the time and not married. I left Dallas, Texas for Seattle, Washington, and it was the early 90s, so the grunge era. Best thing I ever did for myself. I had to get out from under a family I love that was smothering me with advice and instruction. Their views are conservative and evangelical. Mine are not. I was tired of family members showing up at my apartment at dawn on a Saturday. I was tired of lectures about how I should live and what job I should get. And I was also tired of Dallas. It was sprawling concrete and steel and glass even then. Now it's even more enormous. Seattle was a lot more laid back, and people actually walked places. I ran out of money quickly, but got a job, and so there were 2 somewhat miserable weeks eating leftover turkey from Thanksgiving and drinking only water, walking everywhere because I didn't have bus fare. Then I managed to build a life and keep on getting better jobs as the years went by. And when I was 30, I did it again. I left Seattle for a small town in the mountains. I've been here for 20 years and I'm married to a great guy. We have a little house and a cat and a good life together. Jobs out here are whatever you can get. Some are really good, most are not. But a career is not something I want. A living is plenty, and a life is better than a job. Seattle has changed a lot since the 90s. It feels bigger and less laid back. The mountains make me feel home. The sunrises and sunsets here are amazing. The slower pace is nice. The woods all around are forever better than glass, steel, cement. The quiet is amazing. In Dallas, I listened to gunshots and helicopters, traffic and loud neighbors. In Seattle, it was mostly just traffic and loud neighbors. Story number 22. I was addicted to opioids and weighed about 85 pounds. I had killed all of my friendships, quit my job, wrecked my car, and was living in a wood plank shack with a sheet for a door. I didn't have 2 dimes to rub together, and when I did, it went to drugs. I was so depressed that when I looked in the mirror every day, I was excited to see more and more of my ribs and hip bones jutting out, the knots of my spine sticking out in my back, my collarbone and my stick legs, because all this meant was I was successfully closer to dying. One day, I felt like my eyelids were sticky, and it took me all day to realize that my face was just finally skinny enough to where my eyes had sunken a little deeper into my skull, causing my skin on my eyelids to rub together when I opened them after blinking. After one night of particularly heavy drug use, I was kidnapped and SA'd, and I managed to escape wearing nothing except an oversized t-shirt the whole way home. And when I got there, I swallowed all my drugs and overdosed. I woke up in the hospital several days later and finally called my mom and asked her to give me a plane ticket to anywhere, and I promised I would get sober if she did. When I arrived at the airport, I didn't have any money to check my only suitcase in, and so I had to throw it away and board the plane with nothing but a blanket and my ID and a gnarly come down. When I arrived, I felt very lost, very disconnected, but somehow much more safe. I immediately checked into rehab, got clean, gained 40 pounds. After I got out, it took several months to scrape myself off the ground, and I upgraded to living in a super rundown car while working an overnight job and managed to save money to drive where I really wanted to live. Then came my real fresh start. I quickly kept upgrading to better places and better jobs, better car, new friends, etc. And after about a year after I had gotten clean, I was living on my own, with a good car, got into a cool new hobby, went back to school. Within the year after that, I got a job teaching my new hobby, got a great dog, and met a great guy who had moved to my city for a fresh start after he had a bad breakup and a fresh DUI. And a year after that, we were married, in our first house. He began his new career, got himself a good car, things were amazing. Then someone broke into our house, and the ensuing standoff between them and the police literally destroyed everything we owned in the house and the house itself. We had to save for a new house and new belongings, sort of start from scratch. But we had our cars and our jobs and our dogs still, so it was not as hard that time, especially because we had already done it before, and we each had each other. It took us only 3 months to get back to where we were. Actually, better than where we were. These days, I literally feel like a rich person. I'm not by any means at all, and I don't even necessarily think I'm that cool or that good of a person, but just having hot running water and being able to order food from my constantly working phone whenever I want, I feel like a damn wizard. I still sleep in too late. I've been slow about school, but holy crap, I have 3 different kinds of shampoo, bottled water in the fridge, and a spare bedroom that I use as my own personal office, lounge, closet, and I buy my dog bully sticks and Himalayan cheese chews all the time. He knows so many tricks, and my husband, he is a saint too. He's like my example of how I want to treat other people. I am just so effing lucky. If you've ever been low, or if you are low right now, You can just leave. You don't even have to prepare or save up or have anything. As long as you're willing to get humble for now, you can do it. It's worth doing it. It is so worth doing it. Story number 23. I was getting verbal abuse for eating scraps. Yes, scraps. My mother didn't really cook food for me, only my siblings. So when I came home from my first day at my first job, still under 18, and although some family would be like, well, it's stupid, you are grown, you can just take food, you don't have to ask, emotional abuse parents, that is, you expect consequences to everything. So I get home and the verbal abuse starts because I had sore legs and needed to sit down. I was starving hungry. So I ate scraps off of a finished plate of food by the sink, just a bit of egg. And apparently it was the most foul, awful thing a person can do to another person and required immediate expulsion from the family. She pulled that a lot, dumping me outside. Sometimes with no shoes, sometimes socks, sometimes coming home when it was dark and locking the door from the inside and not letting anyone open the door to let me in. Neighbor letting me stay at their place, sleeping on the floor, outside the front door, was homeless here and there and just kept going back. And the laughable thing is that she was the local ambassador for a homeless charity. So I knew she would expect me to be begging to come in after she chucked me out. So I ran and packed a bag with a phone, charger, underwear, and a few items of clothing, said goodbye to my sister, and while she was screaming still about this mouthful of food I had dared to eat that she wanted later, I just left. I got about a mile away when I knew she wasn't following me, and then I called an aunt. She let me stay with her, and it's a bit of a blur as I didn't have a toothbrush or many clothes, and I don't remember going back to them. I never went back. Lived there for a while, but it came with its own problems as I was at college, but also juggling an almost full-time job to pay rent, etc. So I quit college just before the end of the year, got a result, not perfect but still good, as I could actually study without screaming around. I got a decent job, met my husband, we moved in together, found my dream job. I don't think I saw her for about 3 years. Sad, as siblings young, so couldn't see them, and it damaged our relationship, but 2 of us are close now. Anyone that is feeling emotionally or physically abused out there, you don't have to keep living that way. You can call the police and they can deal with stuff and you don't even have to be involved. I wish I had when I was younger. It might have protected all of us. But even if you can't, you can get a job. You can go to a shelter. You can get out of it. Because if you have the guts to escape, you have what you need to succeed in life already. Best thing you can do is apply for university, as you will be away, and if you're in the UK, it's totally affordable, and paying loans back is minimal and it isn't like other debt. Education and a roof over your head with a built-in support system, friends, and socializing. Story number 24. I gave up my half-decent career, healthcare, 2-bedroom apartment, and stability in a boring little city on the East Coast. I pulled my deposit from a lot in a suburb, went to Iceland for a week, and then bought a camper van and started driving west across Canada without not much other than my dog, my guitars, and about $2,000. I thought it would be an amazing adventure. I'd be inspired to write a ton of new songs, maybe even live the van life forever. Well, I ran out of money in Toronto and had to call my mom crying. Turns out gas is expensive, and so is eating out almost every day. She lent me some money and I kept driving. I stayed with a friend in Alberta, parking my van in her driveway for 8 months. That was the most hellish winter of my life. I got work serving and became a supervisor at a restaurant/bar, started drinking a lot and barely saved any money. After a brief relationship that ended in a bad breakup, I quit the job and hightailed it through the Rockies to Vancouver, mid-February during a snowstorm with avalanche warnings. Then I got hired on at the same chain I had been working for in Alberta and did fairly well serving and bartending. I lived in my van at a community center where I paid for a membership to the gym and showered until they kicked all the vans out of the parking lot. It got harder to find good parking spots after that. I started drinking heavily. My only friends were my coworkers and they introduced me to the party scene on Davie Street. That's when I got hooked on coke. On average, I was spending about $200 a night on booze and coke, up to 5 nights a week. Sometimes I had to do a bump in the morning to get myself going. Any dreams I had about Vancouver being my fresh start, my ticket to musical success, my reconnection with nature had totally gone down the toilet, along with my paychecks and tips. My unchecked mental illnesses, previous struggles with addiction that I had overcome for years, and closeted queer identity were all bubbling up to the surface. I had passionate flings that ended in heartbreak, one after another. The heartbreak led to heavier usage to drown my sorrows, and I don't know how I kept my job performance together, but I somehow got promoted to manager. That meant later nights closing up, which sometimes meant not being able to get to my dealer, which meant I spent more than a couple of nights debating whether or not to try my luck on Hastings. I was tempted to take whatever I could get, anything to numb the pain, the itch, the urge, and I am so glad I never quite got that desperate. But then I began to hate myself and the shell of a person I'd become. I knew my dog was living a terrible life, trapped in a van most of the day while I was at work, trapped in the van all night while I was out partying. I always kept him fed and watered and walked, but my God, it was the bare minimum. I thought about turning him into the SPCA because I knew I was failing. I also knew that if I didn't have him anymore, I'd probably take my own life because I'd have nothing left to live for. It didn't take long for things to start getting really dark for me then, and I took too much one night before I had to work the next day, and someone I was dating gave me 1/4 a bar of Xanax. "Take this," he said, "and you'll sleep like a baby." So I drove home to my parking spot, drunk and high. Yes, I'd already demonstrated that I was a total piece of crap, and I popped that little chunk back and laid down. It felt like it took forever to start working. Then, my heart felt like it was too heavy inside my chest. The way it was squeezing out each thud felt like trying to punch in a dream. I struggled to get up out of bed, knowing something wasn't right. I pulled myself up by the edges of the counter, held onto the handles of the cupboards, and propped myself up enough to look in the mirror. My vision was blurry and my lips looked purple, but I started feeling dizzy, so I laid back down. By some miracle, or curse, I woke up. Wow, I thought, why does anyone like Xanax? That was terrifying. After that, I realized I needed to do something. I was out of control and I was going to hurt myself or someone else if I didn't make a change. I pledged to do 30 days sober, which turned into 30 days no drinking, but I still kept doing coke. I was desperately clinging on to the only friend group I knew and wasn't truly ready to give up the partying, but I did remain alcohol-free for 30 days. Then on my way to work one day, I got pulled over by the police. I figured it was probably a busted taillight or something stupid because I was definitely not speeding. I was pissed because I was going to be late for a manager's meeting. The cop then informed me my registration was expired and asked for proof of insurance. That's when I panicked. I'd been so busy getting effed up I totally forgot to renew my registration or insurance, and had never gotten a letter because all my mail was still going to my old apartment. They wanted to impound my vehicle, but I begged and pleaded for an alternative. That was my home. My dog was inside. I had nowhere else to go, and they said I could have it towed to a private parking lot, but could not drive it away. My work was less than 10 blocks away, and I called my manager crying, and they fronted me the cash for the tow truck, and I could park there until I figured something out. I now had a $200 debt to my employer, a $600 traffic ticket, and nowhere to go. I ended up living in the parking garage at work for 2 weeks while trying to get an apartment. I'd managed to save up enough thanks to cutting back on the nights out, but the housing crisis in Vancouver is an absolute nightmare. Eventually, a security guard caught me sneaking out one morning for a shower, and that was the end of being allowed to park there. I had finally hit a total rock bottom. I'm still amazed that I continued not to drink. Then, a coworker let me stay on her couch until I found an apartment, and I had to board my dog at a kennel, renting a U-Haul van to drive him there, and I sobbed the whole way back to my friend's place. I realized I was a homeless addict who couldn't even take care of my dog. All I had left was a job, and it wasn't long after that I got a phone call that one of my friends had died, found cold in his bed, suspected overdose. I would later find out that what killed him was fentanyl, which was in the coke we were all doing, and in the fake Xanax that was going around. They tested the drugs found in his possession, and the only difference between him and I was that he took a whole one and I only took a quarter. I still have survivor's guilt to this day. 2 weeks later, I managed to get an apartment. An inheritance from a family member that had been stalled for the longest time finally got released. Fortunate timing, or else I probably would have drugged or drank myself to death. And I bought some furniture. The happiest day of my life was bringing my dog home to a real home after a month of being separated. And a couple of weeks later, I rented a minivan and drove a group of friends to our buddy's funeral. I vowed then and there that I never wanted to put my family in those shoes. Watching a mother bury her son is a haunting image, and I knew I had to get clean. I struggled for months going back and forth between sobriety and binges. I ended up having to quit my job and cut off all friends. I considered rehab more than once, but I'm stubborn as hell. I went to the gym 6 days a week just to feel something. Stopped pretending to be a bisexual girl and came out as trans non-binary. Got a new job as a barista and became a morning person. Broke up with my girlfriend because she couldn't stay sober for even a day around me. But even though I felt like I lost so much, I knew my life was going in the right direction. I found hardcore music in the straight edge scene, and it saved my life. My first HXC show was Race Trader and Wake of Humanity with some locals. I made sure to tell Chris from Wake that his record changed my life, and I thanked him. I met a straight edge friend who became a partner eventually. We traveled the whole West Coast all the way to Mexico, planning to move back east when we returned, and that was right before COVID hit. We have since broken up, but I decided to move back home by myself. I took what was left of my inheritance and bought a small house in a rural town on the East Coast. In some ways, it feels like I gave up on my dreams of finding glory in the West, but in other ways, it feels like everything has come full circle. I came out here to find myself, and I think I accomplished that, although it came with a heavy price. I have as many memories of beauty as I do of pain, and I see it all as an experience and try to focus on the positive. Don't be afraid to chase your dreams. Just don't forget to look where you're going when you're chasing, or you can get lost in the woods. I was extremely privileged to be able to financially recover in the way that I did, and I'll never forget how close I came to dying or living on the street, and I will never not be humble and grateful, and I will never go down those old roads ever again. Story number 25. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. I experienced the varieties of cultures, learned about so many different parts of the world, and was fortunate enough to meet some very interesting people. But by the time I was 27, I was very, very jaded. Everything was crowded, dirty, expensive. Jobs seemed to only be freelance, and all the best jobs were going to out-of-towners anyway because they had more jolly attitudes, what with growing up in a beautiful house on a hillside somewhere as opposed to roach-infested apartments and walking everywhere. So, a guy I was dating but losing interest in moved around for temp gigs, and about 6 years ago, he landed a gig in Silver Springs, Maryland. When I first visited him, I remembered vividly the smell of the plants and grass along the front of the building. I became so enamored by how much cleaner, more spacious, and closer to nature the DMV was and is. I packed up my crap and I moved. I landed a job pretty quickly, and a few boyfriend and job changes later, I met the man that became my husband, and I then landed the job of my dreams. I've been married for a little over 2 years now and live the suburban American dream. Story number 26. Graduated law school thanks to my mom paying about $100,000 for a law degree and attending the bar. Started in central London, commuted, enjoyed it at the beginning. Pay is not like what you see on the TV shows. Made about $35,000 a year. Deadlines and schedules were super tight, but I kind of enjoyed it. Slowly, within 4 weeks, it was grinding me down though. One day I did 19 hours straight, and I remember after my first paycheck promising to take my dad out for dinner for his 60th birthday to an expensive steak place. My treat. I tell my manager I must be out the door that Friday on time. No problem, he says. Friday comes around, I've worked 11 hours, and it's 4:35. Suddenly, the manager drops a load of papers on my desk and says to me, "These need to be done before you go home today." And he had a satanic grin on his face. Me, I was sat next to an open window. So, I just said F you, picked the stack of papers up, dropped them out the window, grabbed my suit jacket, and left. Best steak ever. Then I told my mom later that night, and she almost threw me out the window. The next day, I booked a trip to China to see a friend, got offered a job lecturing in law, don't ask, dodgy laws, and have had the bug for teaching ever since. Spent years and thousands of pounds getting 2 teaching licenses, UK and US, a master's, and also several qualifications. Now, loving 17 weeks of holiday a year and making $6,000 a month into my bank account every month in Vietnam, while also being fluent in Chinese. Lucky I took the plunge, really. Story number 27. About a decade or so ago, my partner and I were living in a crappy apartment in the Chicago suburbs, both working crappy retail jobs. We got by and we were happy enough, but it wasn't going anywhere. One night, we were drinking together and decided to play around on Google Maps, as you do, and from our place, we just started zooming out, and zooming out, and zooming out some more, and that's when it hit us that we were living right smack in the middle of an endless grid of urban sprawl. You could drive for a couple of hours in any direction and never see the end of a strip mall. That's when we agreed something had to change. We had some friends out in the Pacific Northwest who spoke highly of the area, and they happened to have an open room in their apartment. We made plans pretty quickly, tied up a few loose ends, packed literally everything we owned into a RAV4, and just left. That car was packed so full that if you opened any door, things would come cartoonishly exploding outwards. The one sitting in the passenger seat had a box on their lap the whole way. It took us about 3 days of long, uncomfortable driving, but we made it. There were plenty of times where we thought to ourselves, is this a huge mistake? Are we doing the right thing? But you've just got to remind yourself that you've got this. You're in charge. Story number 28. I've done it twice. Both times were rough. The first time I moved across the world. It was after a friend's brother who shared many similarities to me died from cancer. I threw my hat in the ring for a Hail Mary job, got the job, and then moved to America. For the first few months, the amount of cheese, oil, and sugar and everything made me really sick, and I lost a ton of weight. I sliced my hand open inside the first 2 weeks and lost quite a bit of blood. I was very pale and tired for the next few days, but was too scared of being bankrupted by emergency healthcare because I didn't even have healthcare at the time. I also got depressed because of how dark it was and super homesick because of the isolation to everything. My manager at my new job was eventually replaced with another, and I was pretty much ready to throw in the towel, but I stuck with it. And then I got one of the best managers I could have ever asked for. The job picked up from then, I met a girl, made good memories, etc. Then, the second time, it was divorcing my ex-wife. In the most literal sense of the words, almost everything went to her. I barely made rent when the divorce was finalized. She bought a house. I had to work my way back from scratch, and I would have probably been dead inside of a year if I hadn't left. I kept 2 photos in my phone, one that reminds me of how close I came to dying, and one that reminded me of what I had lost by being with her. Since then, life has looked up. We still chat, mostly her sharing photos of the dog we got together, and I still think she's an incredibly talented woman who I wish the best for. For me, I've bounced back enough to buy a house, and I'm pretty happy overall. Although, there are things that need COVID to disappear enough that I can check off a few bucket list items to truly be okay, like going back to my hometown and visiting my grandparents. Okay, so it's evidently obvious by now that this thread was made sometime during the pandemic, but she took everything and they're still friendly? She took all of your possessions and you were just left out on the street borderline with nothing left and almost came close to dying, according to you, if you hadn't left, and you're like, we're chill now? You know, I appreciate forgiveness and all that, but at least from the information provided here, I'm just, I'm raising my eyebrow a little, like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, just a little bit, because she took everything and you're chill with that. Well, at least you're getting dog photos. I suppose in the eyes of the internet, that or funny cat videos are the best thing you can receive. So I suppose OP is winning. Good for them. Anyway, next story. Story number 29. I kinda did so twice, and it was weird both times. When I was 20, I wanted to get out of an ever more straining parent relationship. I felt my parents were not wanting me to grow up and coddling me too much. I didn't get much independence, and I wanted out. So my American boyfriend and I hatched a plan. I got on a plane with a fiancé visa, and we got married. I spent about 11 years in California. Getting integrated, though, was rough. I spoke fluent English when I came to the States, but I only had a high school diploma, no work experience to speak of, and no real references. That later can be a total pain when you need to list 3 to 5 people not related to you as references on job applications, especially when the only options in the drop-down menu are supervisor, coworker, and teacher. I worked my way through crappy jobs, went to community college, went to get my 4-year degree, had a baby, got my teaching credential, and then crap fell apart. See, I went to the US in 2008, just before the economic crisis. I entered the worst job market ever and ended up taking refuge in the college system, getting scholarships, grants, and eventually student loans to cover my expenses. When I entered the teaching track for my BA, I was told that we can expect several openings the year I was supposed to earn my credential. Then, a lot of teachers retired a year early, and all of those tenure track jobs were filled. I graduated into a dry market, not just in my region, but in California overall. The only job offer I got was in Arizona, making next to nothing and being the sole/primary earner. It was nowhere near enough to support the family. So we moved back to my in-laws. It was a bad idea, and I'd rather not go into details, but we fled. By this time, having produced the one and only grandbaby of my parents, our relationship had started to normalize. They offered help. We moved back to Europe in December of 2020, and just as I got all my paperwork squared away, the COVID pandemic struck. Still, I had an easier time picking it up back here. Probably because I wasn't a little doe-eyed girl with no experience, but came with a college degree, tons of good experience, and a much stronger personality. Story number 30. Did this in September of 2020. Currently living roughly 9 hours drive from home. I'll set the stage for my eventual flight from home. I had just gotten through a pretty terrible divorce in 2019, and the harassment from my ex was unending. He is a narcissist, and I am not exaggerating here. When I finally left, he could not accept that I had found a shiny new spine and would not return. There was a history of cheating, financial and psychological abuse. The veil being lifted was both amazing and terrifying, but I was able to pull through and get myself out of a bad situation. It was awful. Then, just as things had begun to settle down for me, I lost my mother in January of 2020. I was very close to my mom and I was devastated, as was my whole family. Truly an amazing woman, and we were all left shell-shocked and did our best to pick up the pieces and hold each other up. Then I think we all know what happens next. The world went crazy and mine was suddenly off the chain. Roommate moved out. We went into lockdown, lost my job, ex still wouldn't leave me alone. My world was falling apart and it was getting to the point that I didn't know how I was going to continue to keep a roof over my head. Family was an option, but I did not ever want to be their burden. I was applying for jobs everywhere and was getting nothing until finally I got an interview 9 hours from home. They loved me. I was a perfect fit finally. I had no intentions of moving so far, but I needed the job. It's a good job. Couldn't turn it down. My family didn't know I was applying so far from home, so I had to break the news to them that I was leaving. They are the only people I told I was leaving. And so far it's been crazy and hectic and scary and exciting and all things at once. Sometimes I get sad and lonely, but things are finally calming down for me. I close on a new home today. I'm safe. My fur babies are safe. I have food on the table and a roof over my head. Some days I regret my decision and just want to go home. Those days are less frequent, and when it gets really bad, I make the trip to go see my family. Would I do it again? Absolutely. I'm thankful every day I was given this opportunity. Story number 31. In 2014, I decided within a month to pack up and move from Maine to Seattle. I'm a digital artist, and there weren't many opportunities for me in the East Coast other than freelancing and cleaning houses on the side. I moved into a tiny, micro apartment tiny place in the International District during the rainy winter and continued freelancing. It was very hard to make friends because people here are less personable. I knew one person in a nearby town who I'd met while traveling and we started dating, but it was lonely without friends and casual conversation. One day, the owner of the t-shirt site I designed for called me and said he'd found out I moved to Seattle. He asked me to do some contract work for their company at Amazon. It was production art and data entry rather than creative art, but I was feeling so isolated doing freelance in my tiny apartment that I agreed. I made lots of friends through connections at that job, which was the first real job I'd ever had. I never saw myself working in tech or even in an office because I have difficulty with ADHD and working the same routine every day. I need breaks throughout the day and need to be able to design my own workflow, something which I was never allowed to do at other jobs. So, my boss puts me in charge of improving the process we used for creating images for the site and for putting stuff up for sale. I ended up being really good at this because I am lazy and try to automate as much of my life as possible. I got hired on officially after my contract ended and made a life-changing salary, even though I only had an art degree, a profession that many employers on the East Coast told me was useless. I saved up enough money to study video game development, and I am now building my game art portfolio, something I never thought I was smart enough to learn. I was smart enough. I just needed a different environment that valued my smarts. Story number 32. Well, it's about time I get to answer this question. Scary, miserable, and heartbreaking. That's what it felt like. I remember submitting a legal name change, thinking to myself, this is who I am now. That other guy is dead and gone. I spent about 2 years working at McDonald's in some small town you'd never know existed. Small enough where everyone knew each other, but small enough where no one knew anyone else. During my time at McDonald's, I slept in my car. So I'd go to work, stay in my car, and just lay there and do nothing. That is, until I needed to rest before my next shift. I had no friends, no family, nothing but my car and myself. That was until someone stole my car and the police weren't helpful in helping me recover it. I slept outside the back area of McDonald's for the next 4 months until the district manager caught on and told me I couldn't sleep there anymore. I quit the next day and decided after my shift I would unalive myself finally. But on my way to the train tracks, I came across a homeless man. He spoke to me for some time and said, "You're older than most folks, but you're not old yet. Not like me. My life is miserable, but you have enough time to start over again. Read a book or two. I'm sure it would help you." And he had an additional sleeping bag, an old can of corn, and half-eaten burger that he offered me. Said I could eat it with him and stay the night in his bag, but he'd need it back tomorrow after he jumps on the train. So I did. Next morning, I thanked him and went on my way. Decided to try reading a book or two, but didn't know which books to choose. The library was open, so I just went in and looked around a bit. Sure enough, I found something that struck my interest, a book on psychology. I had always wondered why my life was the way it was, why my parents did what they did, etc. I came back to the library for the next few days and finally decided I should try to pursue a career in psychology. It was difficult. I had no home, no address, but could I go to college? Surely not. I enrolled at a community college at the age of 26, hoping my associates in psychology would be the start of a new life. And fast forward, at age 35, I graduated with a PsyD. Today, I'm married, I have 2 children, a beautiful spouse, wonderful home, and a genuinely good life. It was scary, miserable, and heartbreaking to reach where I am today. I'm 42 now, and if I had a choice, I'd leave my old life behind sooner. Story number 33. On the night of December 31st, 2018, I lucked into a place to stay in Los Angeles. I'm from West Virginia. I made the decision to go, I had barely any money, and not much going on. I boarded the flight at 6 a.m. on January 1st, 2019, and started a brand new life in LA. Things went really well for a while. I was able to get on my feet and in my own apartment in less than a year. Then my dumbass ran off to Vegas and got married in November of 2019, which was cool at first. We traveled the country for a month straight in January, came home with what we now think was the coronavirus, but got over that, and we were still sitting in our little LA lives. And then the pandemic hit and everything fell apart. We got stuck inside together and that didn't go well. I lost my job and ended up taking a big pay cut with unemployment due to the structure of how I was paid and me being an independent contractor. My wife's business fell apart and her income was cut drastically due to COVID. By August of this past year, we were divorced and honestly, things happened so abruptly I moved back home with my parents at 30. I mean, it didn't work out great for me, but I did learn a lot from it. And I'm moving back to LA once it opens up once more and after I get the vaccine. I've started my own business now and make more money than I did before, and I have been with a new girl for like 5 months and things have been going good. No getting married again anytime soon though. Story number 34. During COVID, like a lot of other folks, our world changed. We also got pregnant in November of 2019, so the majority of my pregnancy took place in the height of the pandemic. We had our baby in July. My husband lost his job and business and was on CERB, as well as me being on maternity. Our financial situation went from stable, keeping our heads above water, to being 2 months away from financial disaster. With a new baby, it forced us to take a serious look at our life and how it was serving our priorities, and we realized we weren't getting what we wanted, and if we kept along our path, we likely wouldn't. So we found a house we liked, renovated and sold our current one, and prepared to move from a community of 35,000 to a community of 400. The house was so effed, so our deal fell through and we had signed away our current home. We were going to be homeless. However, the stars aligned and we ended up winning the bid on a court-ordered sale in a different community of about 1,300 people. We bought our new house cash and are selling off other investments and will have a significant amount of money in our bank. So we went from possibly going bankrupt to being well set up in a paid-off 3-bedroom house with room to grow in a community that's geared towards actually being a community. We have the ability to pursue our dreams of being artistic, self-sufficient, and free from debt. So thank you, COVID, for effing up our lives long enough to force us to choose a better one. So I've read a lot of these stories on Undersparked and Really Sparked, and we get, handfuls of pandemic stories, but I have to say, I think this is the first time, at least from reading these Reddit stories, that I've heard someone thank the pandemic, right? Their good stuff can come out of it, sometimes, but I think this is the first time someone said, thank you, coronavirus, you've improved my life. That is a new one for me. Anyway, next story. Story number 35. I've read through a lot of the thread and I feel inspired. I did this. Best thing I ever did, and if I hadn't, I'm pretty sure I would be dead or an alcoholic today. I would say that there's a lot of survivorship bias here, and if you're contemplating doing something like this, be prepared for a lot of hardship. However, here's my tale. In 2002, I found myself living in Denmark with a former girlfriend in an apartment we subletted for my mom, and my life was hell. Constant drama, and I was contemplating ending it all. Looking back, I think I might have had a mental breakdown. So I decided that if that was on the table, I might as well just walk out the door and never look back. It couldn't get any worse. I didn't know where to go, always been very afraid of uncertainty, but I got in touch with an old American friend, and even though we hadn't spoken in 7 years or so, he said, "Come on over, mi casa, su casa." And so I bought a ticket to Venice, California, and left without saying goodbye. I've never felt so happy as when my friend picked me up at the airport and I could breathe freedom. I sent letters to my family and ex-girlfriend, and while my dad and second mom, stepmom, but always been more of a mom to me than my real mom, were understanding, I forever lost contact with my mom and ex-girlfriend, which, in hindsight, is a very good thing. I'd only planned to be there for a few months, but my friend offered to share his meager resources with me, and eventually I found a job and stayed for altogether 5 years. During that time, I became a much better person. I learned that I had a body and that I needed to take care of it in order to be happy, and now I'm in better shape than I've ever been. And I lived in Venice, Malibu, Idaho, and upstate New York, and everywhere I went, I met the most amazing people and had a lot of fun. A few things I learned. Always trust in the kindness of strangers. Don't rely on it or expect it, but when you're at your lowest, chances are that someone can help. I try to pass that on and feel privileged that I've been able to on several occasions. Just an example, I'd been in Venice for about a month and I was very worried about my situation. One day I was walking by the beach when a homeless lady yelled at me. Normally, I would just ignore that, but feeling like I did, I stopped and asked her what was up. She needed help cutting a foam mattress to fit her shopping cart, and while we did, I told her my situation and she told me that I was a fool. I was at a beautiful, warm place and had friends. What was I complaining about? As I left, she offered me a quarter for a cup of coffee, which I declined, but that's when I realized the truth of the saying, always trust the kindness of strangers and try to pass it on when you can. Next, try to plan. When I got to the US, I realized that my passport would run out in about 8 months, so I had to go back. But this turned out to be a good thing since I could patch up things with my family as well as make a little extra cash, since I worked for starvation wages in the US. Also, while planning is a good thing and now I try to do it, I realize that no plan survives in the real world. Nothing I've planned has ever turned out the way I imagined. Instead, it turned out different and, in most cases, better. Continuing, be open. Danes are a very emotionally stunted people, and when I got to the US, I would spend a lot of time bickering and moaning, but my new friends would inform me of how bad this was for my psyche and for people around me. We would spend countless intoxicated nights sharing our most private thoughts, and while I'm still relatively clueless about myself, I'm now a lot more self-aware than I was. Next, how privileged I am. I grew up in a very left-wing setting and learned from an early age that all the world's ills stemmed from white men screwing up the world. While I understood this intellectually, while resisting it emotionally, it wasn't until I experienced how my white skin protected me in the US that I finally internalized it. This doesn't mean I beat myself up about it, just that I try to help out when I can and be more understanding of people who don't have this. Continuing, how lucky I am. There's so many times when things could have gone severely wrong for me and it didn't. Not really something I can do anything with, except realize that someday my luck will run out and be grateful while it lasts. Then, I came back to DK in 2007, and because I'd become a lot more self-aware, I realized that I have, and always had, ADHD. Getting medicated meant that I finally got an education as an automation technician, but it hasn't been smooth sailing. In 2014, I felt down again and moved to Spain, where I got the worst job ever. But again, I met some amazing people and learned a lot about myself. Now I'm back living in DK and feeling trapped again. I think of the US as my spiritual mother country and would love to go back, but can't find a path forward. Hopefully, I finally win the green card lottery next autumn. So, in closing, if you're at your wit's end, going out that door might be a good idea. Just try not to hurt anyone on the way, but also don't accept others hurting you. Know that there might be some pain and hunger on the way, but if you open your heart, things can get better. Story number 36. I will attempt to be brief here. My husband of 15 years and I were having an argument and he assaulted me. I called law enforcement and he was in custody overnight. I pressed charges and went to court, acquired a do not contact order and a restraining order. I did extreme no contact. We had no children, so I wasn't even curious about where he was, and I was comfortable with this estrangement. I moved to another state and started divorce proceedings. Evidently, he moved to another state as well, but when I started a DIY divorce, I didn't have his address. I did remember that when we were living together, we shared a Walgreens account. So when I received a shared email to pick up the latest refill prescriptions, his address was right there in front of me. I started a post office box for communications with him regarding the divorce so he would not know where I lived. And 2 years later, I received a call. My number was on his phone, and from one of his housemates saying that he had collapsed, a heart attack, kidney failure, in the parking lot and was taken to the ER of a local hospital. A bit of backstory. His health had been failing due to prostate cancer, throat cancer, arthritis, and injuries from reckless cycling, so he was constantly medicated, in constant pain from his arthritis. He spoke daily about self-unaliving, describing in detail his method of choice. All this became a perfect storm, aided and abetted by the stress of filing for bankruptcy. Now back to the story. The housemate said that he did not want the EMTs to take him to the hospital because he could probably only see more of the same. More pain, more trauma. If he was treated and then released, and things would just continue over and over again. Since he desperately wanted to end this cycle via self-unaliving, this physical collapse did the job, and I never saw him again, not even when he drew his last breath. Because of his continual ongoing descriptions of his proposed self-unaliving, I can imagine him thinking, OMG, at last, finally, the moment I've been waiting for, and I didn't even have to do it myself, what luck. I then contacted his two daughters, also estranged, and asked them to take charge of things because I hadn't seen him in years and no longer felt emotionally connected to him. They took care of things, discarded his personal belongings, contacted the crematorium, etc. This was on a Monday, and on Wednesday they took him off of life support, which is what he wanted. I didn't go to his memorial service where people gathered to say goodbye, even though his family members were also hurting. Throughout his life, he loved sailing, loved being out on the water, loved living near the water, and together we had spent 3 years blue water cruising the Caribbean and South America. After about a week or so, his daughter sent me an email with a photo of a sailboat sailing around a pond with the caption, John's last sail. Story number 37. I moved a year ago tomorrow, actually. I had been through a lot. In 2017, I had been diagnosed with bone cancer after just standing up breaking my leg. Had to drop out of nursing school in the last 11 days because the instructors wouldn't let me do bookwork instead of my last few clinicals. Been in a wheelchair in extreme pain for a year while I recovered. My dad died, and my husband lost his mind, and I told him to quit his 80-plus hour a week salary job to go back to a part-time position, which meant we had to move back in with my mom and my young sisters, one who has special needs. The end of 2018, after I recover and can somewhat limp around, I finish nursing school, pass NCLEX, get hired, and move back out into a lovely house. I got a job and things were looking up. Well, my anxiety and depression had never been higher. I just plummeted. I was always high functioning with my anxiety and depression, diagnosed at age 14, but this time I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't shower. I couldn't brush my teeth for weeks. My job was for a company that did not care about its staff nor its patients, and it ate away at me. We had always talked about leaving the town we grew up in, and with my new career as a nurse being very versatile, I signed up for traveling nursing emails, but didn't have enough experience as a new nurse yet. One day in 2019, I got an email for an assignment in a state I had always wanted to go to, one where none of my toxic family were, and I had just hit another new low point at work, feeling unappreciated and frustrated. I went directly to the hospital site and applied and emailed the hiring manager. I was lucky and got hired a week later, did a phone interview and everything. Well, I didn't have my license for that state yet, so I had to apply and wait for it to be approved, so I kept my job in the meantime. Finally, a few months later, it was approved as temporary, and I selected my start date, February 17th, 2020. In January of 2020, I'd had enough money to move and work was worse than ever, so I quit on the spot after being yelled at by an MD for his own mistake. I gave everything I owned away except a carload of clothes and a few boxes of childhood stuff, and we left February 7th and got here February 10th. Life improved immensely. I was a fully functional adult once again. Job was wonderful, makes me glad to be a nurse. I still struggled with anxiety, but I had never felt happier. Best 5 months of my life. Even with COVID, which came into full force a few weeks after I got here, until my sister died on July 19. She was 18, I was 25. I guess sometimes we just can't win in life, but I don't regret moving. Story number 38. It wasn't one day, but from when I had the idea to the move was about 2 weeks. I was working in Vancouver in construction, worked my way up over 6 years with a big builder from laborer to carpenter apprentice to carpenter foreman, then junior superintendent. Suddenly, they lost a couple of huge contracts and I was offered to be laid off or go back to laborer. Pay basically cut in half. I asked for a week to think about it. I looked at jobs, looked at going back to school, nothing really clicked. Then I looked at how much my condo was worth and I pooped out a brick. Tripled in value in 3 years. Then I looked at Prince George, right dab central British Columbia, the northern hub, and I looked at jobs there. Paid a bit more than the coast for entry level. I decided right then and there to sell the condo and give away everything that didn't fit in my truck. Literally called the prettiest realtor in the first page of the Google search and bam! And here I am in Prince George just over a year later, making more than I did on the coast. Living on acreage that I bought on cash. Been dating a girl I met here for 8 months and it's the happiest I've ever been in my life. Working 40 hours a week, no overtime and no 2-hour commute. Except for the cold, F the cold. But everything else is great. All because my old job lost a couple of contracts. Story number 39. So, back in 2018, I booked a flight, packed one suitcase and one backpack, grabbed my savings of $3,000, and left a small town close to Stuttgart, Germany, to move all the way to Toronto, Canada. I was 18, 19 at the time, just graduated from high school and only had 6 months of work experience for my job as a waitress, as well as 6 weeks for my summer job at Daimler. On top of that, I was in a very unstable place mentally. I used to be filled with self-hatred, blaming myself for everything that had gone wrong in our family and general lives. My mom is a single parent, my father didn't pay child support, and I haven't seen him since I was 5, and I have one brother who's 2 years younger than me. There was also depression, anxiety, wanting to self-unalive thoughts, and trying to find love in the wrong places are just a few of the examples of what I was dealing with at the time. We also moved quite often, so I went to 2 different elementary schools and 3 different high schools. Building friendships was extremely difficult because I'm also an introvert. Anyway, I've made the experience early on that many people tend to exploit your goodwill and naivete, which inevitably added to my depression and anxiety as I never felt good enough for anything or anyone. I was in a toxic environment and I needed to break myself free. In my eyes, the only way to save myself and not sink deeper into my depression and possibly turn to alcohol, drugs, and even more wrong people was to move to another country where I can improve myself without being limited by my family and friends, as they always threw me 10 steps back once I saw minor improvements. It was like a cycle, working on myself, seeing improvements, other people commenting on it, and destroying my progress. So I had to start from scratch again and again and again. Honestly, it was the best decision of my life to leave everything behind, and also probably the only reason I'm still alive. I found relatively quickly an office job at an international IT company. After staying at an Airbnb for the first month in Toronto, I moved into a bachelor apartment, and I could slowly see that my mood and outlook on life started to improve. I was still very introverted, but I pushed myself out of my comfort zone, scheduled appointments, went out to meet people, and so on. Now, over 2 years later and being 21, I'm filled with self-confidence, and I can finally say that I'm proud of the person that I've become. I finally fell in love with myself and life in general. I dragged myself out of this hole and turned my life around. The only downside is that while my life was moving forward, that the life of my family was somehow stuck, as my mom still lives a lot in the past. So when I went back to visit them, it kind of showed that I'm not compatible with that life in Germany anymore. I do get along with my family, but I've distanced myself for my own sake. Sorry for this long story, but maybe someone in a similar position is out there and just feels like giving up. If you have the possibility, then leave everything behind. Yes, it is tough. I was struggling financially a lot too because I started college as an international student in 2019 and I'm about to graduate by the end of this year. But you can make it work. Everything will take a lot of time and you really need to be patient. I also met the wrong people here in Toronto, but it was easier for me to cut these people off here in Toronto compared to Germany because I finally have 100% control over my life. And now I found my best friend here who has my back no matter what. Having a strong support system is important, and sometimes you're not able to find it in the place that you were born and raised in. Story number 40. This will need a bit of background. My mom comes from a very conservative, Orthodox Asian family. She fell in love with a charming and seemingly amazing British guy, my dad. Her family was not supportive of this marriage and cast her out and disowned her. Less than a year into the wedding, my dad's true colors started showing. He is the most narcissistic, abusive, manipulating piece of crap I have ever known. He started hitting her here and there, and by the time I was old enough to understand what was going on, maybe 4 or 5 years, he had escalated onto full 20-plus minute fight sessions where he would beat the crap out of my mom. He would smash her head into the wall, and the bloodstains on the walls remained for years, discolored but distinct. He would use cable wires to whip both me and my mom bloody. I was all of 5 years old and a skinny girl. He would hit her with a hammer. It was brutal torture. Even after all these years, those memories haunt me. I'm crying as I write this. I feel like I'm close to an anxiety attack. I thought I was over these things, but how do you get over a lifetime of torture? I've been suppressing these memories for over a decade now. Dad was also an alcoholic. Mom made whatever money she could doing odd jobs, like make incense sticks for a handmade factory, etc. There weren't a lot of jobs for women in the country about 20 years ago anyway, and Dad would beat the crap out of us, take whatever money she had left, go get drunk, and repeat the cycle the next day. I don't know how I endured this trauma, and so I don't know why my mom put up with it for years. She has no family, and divorce was such a taboo for her she wouldn't even consider. The horror story continued pretty much until I was 15. I started working from the age of 10, but again, there weren't a lot of jobs for a skinny Asian girl of 10 years old, and I did what I could. On the rare days that we would have a third meal of the day, it would be a great day. Finally, my uncle found out the truth and, without telling the rest of my maternal family, helped me get a visa for the UK, along with my mom. It took me several months to convince my mom to just leave everything and move to the UK. I was scared crapless that my mom would rat out our plans out of fear, but luckily she pulled through and we absolutely disappeared in the middle of the night when my dad was probably drunk senseless and sleeping in some brothel. Honestly, the best thing I've ever done. The first few years were absolutely horrendous, but we had some support from my maternal family eventually. They started coming around to my mom and me. I sometimes wonder about what my dad is doing and who he's torturing now. I wish we had filed a police report or done something to restrict him, but we didn't. It's one thing on my conscience, that he's torturing some poor woman because I didn't report him. We didn't tell anyone because we didn't want him to have any clue where we were. Life has turned out to be a lot better without him. Anyone in an abusive relationship reading this, please get out while you still can. It's a horrible situation for your children to be in as well. Numerous scars all over my body, several broken bones, all are witnesses to this statement. Please don't stay in an abusive relationship. Story number 41. I was in my early 20s just working a weekend bar job in a town in England. Didn't make much, but was just about paying my rent. Decided to move to Scotland. I gave everything I owned away on Thursday except a backpack full of clothes and a paperback copy of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. And on Friday, I got a £1 megabus one-way ticket to Edinburgh. I had £65 in my pocket, just enough money for basic food and a week's stay in a hostel in Edinburgh. And that was in 2008. The first few weeks was relatively easy and exciting, doing odd jobs for the hostel, picking up bar shifts here and there, and just making myself useful to pay my way. There were ups and downs. I couldn't find work a few times and ended up on the streets for a few months and things got really bad. But I wasn't a stranger to homelessness. When I left England, I didn't have any formal education. Really, long story of terminally ill parents and other priorities as a kid, but I found my feet and ended up starting a college course to get the formal qualifications I should have gotten in school. Now, I've been with my wife since 2010. We've got 2 kids, a 5-year-old and 2-year-old, and I have multiple qualifications in biological and biomedical science, digital games design and development, and an honors degree in computer animation. Looking at where my life was headed before I left, there was a good chance I wouldn't have survived until now. My life took twists and turns and I never would have expected. Yes, it was incredibly hard at times, but honestly, I'd make most of the choices over again. Story number 42. Honestly, it was incredible at first, but things quickly changed. I up and left in the middle of the night after being assaulted by my ex. My ex is an attorney. We live in a very small town, everyone knows everyone, and this family runs our local hospital and most of our satellite care facilities, doctor offices associated with hospital, urgent cares, pharmacies, etc. This tremendously complicated things. I had a broken toe, whiplash, misaligned neck and concussion. I was 6 weeks out from my last chemotherapy treatment too. The night I left, honestly a couple of days after I was beaten, my ex said to me, "I could kill you and get away with it," followed by the most maniacal laugh I'd ever heard. I was scared. After he fell asleep, I loaded up as much as I could fit into my car, loaded up my dog, and left Kentucky for a place I had never been before, the Rocky Mountains. Initially, I was mesmerized by the foreign beauty of the mountains. I had never traveled west of Arkansas until that day. Colorado is so beautiful. As a woman, there is an indescribable feeling of respect and understanding within most communities out west versus communities of the south. I felt liberated. Unfortunately, I was running away from my problems, and things began to slowly rip at the seams. My ex was full on stalking me. From 2016 to 2019, I changed my phone number over 30 times. Despite the fact that I have AT&T and my ex has AT&T, the service provider did nothing to penalize my ex for calling me thousands of times a day. I still don't know how he got my phone numbers every single time. I heard he was using some attorney system where he could find any information on me based off my birthday and social security number. Who the F memorizes someone else's security number? My psychotic ex, that's who. And I couldn't get a job. I had difficulty making friends due to the severity of my stalker situation, plus having to change my number so often. I felt so much shame. During this time, one of the most stressful questions for me to answer was, "Why did you move to Colorado?" For some reason, this question always made me panic. I think because I felt people would be skeptical of my character based off of the negativity that surrounded my life. There is a lot more info that I won't delve into, but I will skim over. May 1st, 2017. I ended up at The Refuge, a healing place in Florida, and this place saved my life and they urged me to move back home to reclaim it from my stalker. June 27th, 2017. A moth flies in my ear at the Everglades. A few days later, that ear is bleeding. A doctor in West Palm Beach ends up cauterizing the inside of my right ear, leading me to live with trigeminal neuralgia, aka self-unaliving disease, the most painful condition known to man. January 2018. My dog is diagnosed with kidney cancer. She passes on January 31st, a couple of weeks after my birthday. The vet gave her 4 days to live, but she lived 28 days after her diagnosis. June 2018. Depression is weighing heavy on my soul. Living at my family's farm has exhausted me. My ex is still stalking me and harassing me, and I'm ready to throw in the towel. Within the next month, I say, F it. If I can't beat him, join him. I am mentally fatigued at this point, and I get back with my abusive ex. I don't like talking about it because this is still bringing me shame, but it is my truth. Then the abuse continues, not shocking at all, and over the next 8 months, I somehow withstood more physical abuse than ever before. Had an iPad thrown so hard at me that it bent and shattered upon contact with my right shoulder blade. The death threats start again, so I move my stuff out of his house, and the last time I spoke to him in person, he said, "If you call the police, I will kill you." I was mortified. The police were involved, but because of my ex's last name and the clout he has locally, the cops did nothing. In fact, they laughed about the situation with my ex in my front yard. He would come to my house anytime he felt like that and would bang on the doors, the windows, attempt to break in. This was one of those nights. I got him banned from the property, but that didn't matter. He got smarter about the way he was stalking me. There is a lot more to this story, but I don't want to waste my time writing something so intimate when I know this will likely have no impact on anyone whatsoever. Long story short, my abuser met someone in October of 2019, and they got married in February of 2020. I do not recommend just packing up and leaving your life behind on a whim. Planning your move equals a higher rate of success and happiness. So I have to applaud OP for saying, hey, have a plan instead of just leaving your life behind on a whim. I think a lot of these stories are kind of cool, and sometimes, the situation may call for it, but, in general, having a plan in life is usually good for you. If you do want to up and leave, that's fine, do your thing, but maybe up and leave with a plan if you can. I just really appreciate some of the stories here that don't romanticize the idea entirely. There are some people where it just went great for him, and a lot of these stories, do end up with people in better positions after a really rough, rocky start or middle, but I just appreciate stories that give you the full perspective and say, yeah, I was lonely, I lost contact with people, it was really hard, because this is a big decision that people are making, so I'm glad that people are trying to paint as much of the full picture as they can. Anyway, next story. Story number 43. Finally, a thread I can participate in. I left a small Midwest town and moved to Texas. There were a lot of factors. I had an ex who was abusive, mentally and physically, and that led me to my first and only self-unaliving attempt. He was still trying to keep in touch with me, and I felt so trapped. I daydreamed so much about disappearing, which eventually fueled the romanticizing for a sudden and drastic move. Leaving seemed like such a dream, though. Like crap you'd only see a movie protagonist do, and I worked at Pizza Hut, so I didn't exactly make enough to just up and go. Then the straw that broke the camel's back was my friend, female, took advantage of me while I was incredibly drunk and incoherent. After that, I had trouble speaking to anyone at all. I had a really strong, healthy bond with my family before that, but I was just so mentally checked out that we couldn't communicate anymore. I think they realized that I wasn't doing okay, and my birthday was coming up, so they helped me throw a birthday party with a mini GoFundMe goal so I could move. My entire family helped me raise around $1.5K, and with that, I contacted some old friends in Texas who let me couch hop. I lived between friends for about 3 months before I finally got a job in the medical field. I went to film school, and now I currently have my own place, a sick gaming setup, and a pretty easy job that I make decent money with. I am in an incredibly healthy relationship, and I couldn't be happier, healthier, more free. I really do believe that moving saved my relationship with my family. I think the changes in my personality really took a toll on them, and I think the distance made me appreciate them so much more. I don't know what kind of person I would be, or if I would be alive if I didn't move. Story number 44. I was in college in my home state. I was doing well, despite the minor shell shock that comes from being in a conservative religious household for 17 years in a small town to 100% freedom, drugs I had never seen before, house parties on Tuesday nights, and taking home any guy that showed mild interest in me. I didn't know it at the time because living in a religious household, my mother told me my mental issues were dark spirits and I needed to go to church and read the Bible more, but I was undiagnosed bipolar 2 for almost 10 years. After an extremely abusive relationship that ended in his infidelity and me attempting to take my own life, amongst the psychedelics and alcohol and endless Tinder dates, I met my now husband. He was a nurse in another state, and I had my profile stable enough for him to ask me on a date. After the date, we became serious. It was amazing. Around the 5 to 6 month mark, I went into a severe mania. He recognized my symptoms immediately and got me on medicine and the help I needed. My whole world came crashing down once my head stabilized. Who the hell had I become? On a whim, I quit my job, dropped out of college, and we both moved in together to another state. I kept my pregnancy and birth announcement limited to just family for over a year. I had deleted all social media and moved to a cabin in the middle of the woods. And I'm typing this with my husband's last name as my own, listening to our little girl blabber, "Hey Dada," and making plans with my business partner, a job that I adore that allows me to stay at home, and we're talking about a business trip in 2 weeks. This didn't include as much detail as I would like. It's hard being on my phone during the day with a 6-month-old, and it isn't nearly as meaningful as some of the other comments I was reading, but getting up and starting over quite literally saved my life. Sometimes I'm ashamed of who I used to be and the things I have done, but my husband never fails to remind me of how far I've come since then. If you are ever considering starting over, I highly encourage it. Story number 45. Hey, I think I qualify. About 3 years ago, I was in a rough spot emotionally. I was engaged to a man who ended up being abusive, and at the same time, my relationship with my family was deteriorating. I was working a job I hated just to pay the bills. After the death of my grandfather, a horrible funeral, and a final falling out with my fiancé, I kicked him out for good. I cut ties with the more toxic members of family for a while as well. I knew it was time that I had a big conversation with myself about what I most wanted from life. Then, I basically allowed myself to go off the deep end in the most controlled way possible. I started working a second job at a restaurant to improve my people skills and get my savings account up. As it turns out, I loved it and quickly made bartender. I started looking for a better first job as well, and pushed myself to look outside of the state. After about 6 months, I had the opportunity to move to California to work for a much smaller company. So I took it, and unfortunately, it was the worst job of my life, but at least it got me out of my normal routine. If I could go back, I wouldn't change my decision. Over the next 2 years, I found my current job that I love, cycled through 6 different haircuts and colors, picked up backpacking, worked on improving my sex life, picked up surfing and backpacking, met some of the most amazing friends I will ever have, and eventually reconnected with some of my family members. My life isn't perfect by any means. I still have a lot of work to do on my mental health, and some days still suck, but at least I feel like it's mine instead of being tossed around by the circumstances around me. Story number 46. 2019 was really effed for me. My job passed me over for 2 promotions in favor of less qualified candidates, and my boss told me it was because she didn't want to train someone else to do my current job, because it was so complicated, and I did so well at it, she said. Then, I rented a home in April with my fiancé, who cheated on me and left me in August. Something inside of me just exploded. 3 years of pent-up rage consumed me, and for once in my miserable life, my effed up life, I was selfish. In September, I booked a 10-day vacation in Hawaii with my wedding fund and completely cut off my ex financially. I moved into a cheap, crappy studio month to month and started saving money. I put in notice in November that I was leaving my job by Christmas, so it looks like they would have to train a replacement for me anyway. During the Christmas holidays, I warned my parents and grandparents that I was moving out of state soon. I got approved to move into an apartment in Portland during the last week of December. On January 2nd, 2020, I had sold and donated all of my belongings except a few outfits and some sentimental crap. Then, I shipped my car to my new address and flew from Virginia to Oregon with my 2 cats. My car arrived 2 weeks after me, so I explored Portland for 2 weeks by bus. I bought an air mattress, a crap ton of books at Powell's, and some stuff to cook with. I spent my first week exploring and generally got used to living in a big city. On January 8th, I started a new job. Started dating a great guy and became best friends with his sister-in-law. We went on a ton of adventures together. I spent the extra money I had from my new higher-paying job on a trip to Vegas, Arizona, LA, to meet my new boyfriend's parents and extended family. In February 2020, my company went under. In March 2020, I got hired on at a new company. The week I was supposed to start, the big Rona hit, and I ended up working remotely until May. My boyfriend lost his job in the tourism industry, and I kept thinking to myself that of all the people on this planet, I am the only one who could get effed so spectacularly that when I finally decide to do something for myself, an effing widespread global pandemic hits and the whole world shuts down. Then, I decided to stop feeling sorry for myself. I enrolled in grad school and started a master's program online. I figured if I was stuck at home, I might as well use that time to get some crap done. And I am currently applying to even higher paying jobs in my area that will allow me to save money. My boyfriend and I are talking about getting in on the Houston boom right now and buying a cheap property in the suburbs there and doing the whole marriage and family thing. I'll be applying to PhD programs that'll start in fall of 2022 or 2023. Life is a lot better now. Story number 47. It has been the best choice I could have ever made for myself. This is kinda long and I apologize in advance. A bit of backstory. The place I used to live was so toxic and I was so depressed, sad, and angry all the time. An alcoholic before I even turned 21. Then, to top it off, a huge life-altering event happened on April 3rd, 2017. I was involved in a horrible rollover wreck, sitting passenger as my now ex was driving. A lady in the oncoming lane was high on prescription drugs from a dentist appointment and driving to wherever, probably home, and she crossed the yellow. She was apparently staring at the ocean, which there was not a view of the ocean at all, not for a mile down the road at least. She struck the vehicle my ex and I were in, clipping the rear driver's side, sending us into a spin. We only spun 90 degrees, now sliding sideways down the road, and the back half of the truck went down into a ditch about 4 to 5 feet deep, which I think stopped us from continuing to spin out of control after initial contact. We slid about 100 yards coming to a driveway. We hit the driveway on passenger side of the truck with such force it sent the truck up into the air, spinning and rolling. We landed and rolled another time across the driveway into a slight embankment of bushes and trees, taking out a pole and mailboxes that went through the windshield into the cab. And the pole went through the roof of the cab, down through the middle of the beach seat inside the cab. Both I and my ex survived and were able to even walk away. I now have permanent damage to my lower back and my hips and neck. My now ex has lower back injuries as well, and I am not too sure of any others. The woman who caused the wreck was unscathed as her car just glided to a stop alongside of the road. How lucky of her. The rest of the year I spent fighting and even angrier than ever with my now ex. I was not even on talking terms with my mother and father, and they lived in a different state. By the end of 2017, I finally had it. I couldn't wink, I was in pain all the time. My relationship was toxic and so was my family, and they were unreliable and trustworthy. I had but 2 friends I could rely on. I was in a very dark hole. I needed to leave. I needed to get out, especially for medical reasons as the hospital and staff were not reliable and I couldn't count on anything to happen for any improvement on my injuries. I packed my things and moved to a different state. Since December of 2017, my life has been an uphill climb for the better. I ended up meeting a guy a month or 2 after I moved. Of course, I was not very upfront about a lot of things in my past. I still want to forget about a lot, but unfortunately, I have a lifelong lasting permanent reminders. But I am still with the man I met after I moved, and he has been such a big step in my life and has brought me so much happiness. I truly love him, and now we have a cute little pup that we got over a year ago. I have a house of 14 acres of land. After my settlement from the rollover, I received basically nothing. The payout was for $50K, but I personally only got $10K of it. The rest went to insurance companies, medical bills, and my lawyer. I've learned that sometimes, every time, without a doubt things are not going to go how you would like. I even quit smoking cigarettes and quit drinking when I left. I wanted desperately for a change and something to be happy for, and I have never really felt truly happy about anything, not until jumping ship. The drastic change in my life had to happen for me to start healing. I tend to always see the positive side of things now. Compared to me before I jumped ship and started new, I have done a 100% 180-degree change of who I was and who I am, how I think and how I go about things. I have changed for the better in so many ways, and I have a lot to thank to my partner/SO for. He has been the biggest help to my recovery, both physically and mentally. Jumping ship and leaving to start fresh is something that just needs to be done sometimes. Story number 48. After high school, I decided that I wanted to go to college, but in Canada, French Canada, more specifically Quebec City, Quebec. I had been learning French for years at school, and I thought I would be just fine going to French Canada. But when I got there, I was met with a very hard struggle of understanding what the F people were saying. Quebec City is the most French major city in North America, where 95% of people speak French as a first language. And let me tell you that it's not what you learn at school at all. At first, everything was kind of cool and new, but it turned into a weird almost situation. The Quebec City region looks so much like several parts of the US at the same time, but strangely like a weird version of Colorado in the summer with the open sky and mountains in the distance, albeit not as big. Everyone spoke French all the time, which was great, but because of Quebec's language laws, everyone everything from street signs to Starbucks coffee being changed by name just became so strange. I started to pick up on this pseudo-American nation and how strange it was. Coming from America, a place that looked so similar didn't make sense. It felt like I was trapped in a strange dream with a language I only partially understood. It was so close to home yet so far. Why was everyone speaking it? Why was it so normal? I remember how strange it was when I would see the types of people you would see in the US, but speaking in French, and how crazy and weird it was, even though it shouldn't have been. Eventually, I got used to it and learned the language and explored Quebec, including its mountainous regions and saltwater St. Lawrence estuary, and Gulf, and their beautiful beaches and mountains above those same beaches where you can spot whales and even dolphins and narwhals apparently. But all I know now is that I want to live a small and simple life as a bilingual biologist somewhere in Quebec in peace for the rest of my life. See you never, New Jersey. Oh, now the story makes more sense. OP lived in New Jersey and wanted to get the hell out as fast as possible. Everything clicks now. Like I mentioned earlier, if you can have a plan, that's fine. And it seems like OP didn't have too much of one, seeing as they probably didn't do much research on the language aspect of Quebec. But you know what? I did not say this earlier. The exception is, if you live in New Jersey, do whatever you need to leave. Anyway, next story. Story number 49. It was the best decision of my life. This would be a massive post if I had to write everything that happened, so I will try to sum it up. I'm born and raised in Argentina, and although it's not the worst country ever or as bad as many, not travelers think, it's not the place I wanted to be. Ever since I was 10, I would talk to my parents about migrating in the future and discover all these amazing cultures and finding out how people around the globe lived. After I finished high school, I decided to study something short, which would give me the possibility to migrate and find a job everywhere. So I decided to study networking for 1 year. It was a fast course, but it kind of helped in the sense that I could at least get some interviews after finishing it. Anyways, I came up with a plan. 1. Get a job, do 1 year there and have some experience in IT. 2. Save up all the money I was getting from the job since I was still living with my parents. And 3. Start the endless paperwork to get my European citizenship in place. And the same way I planned it in my head, it happened. Fast forward 2 years, I achieved all 3 things I had in mind. And there I was, with a ticket to Scotland and money to survive for 4 months. It was going to be the first time I was on a plane, so I was scared to death. My English was decent, but not as good as it is today. I landed in Scotland, and I knew I wasn't going to be able to find a job in my field right away, so I did what needed to be done. Collected rubbish on the streets, did dishes for a few months, sold hot dogs for a few days. A lot of crazy crap happened in that year, but to sum it up, I ended up meeting one of my exes, and I found myself living in Sweden 1 year later. That's when the good life started. I managed to find a job in IT, and the rest is history. I went from having a crappy job in Europe to traveling the world doing Linux. I lasted 3 years in Sweden, and then I moved to Amsterdam, and here I still am. I just signed a contract to work for one of my dream companies, and I will be traveling more than ever before. It's been 6, almost 7 years now since I left my home country, and I'm finally in touch with people all over the world like I always pictured it in my head. All the efforts were worth it, and I always believed in myself. My advice to others to achieve something similar is to be logical with what you expect from life and what decisions you take. Also, don't listen to all the negativity around you. Back when moving abroad was just a dream to me, even my parents would tell me crap like, don't make us laugh. So don't let these things affect you as much, and believe in what you feel you are capable of doing. The things I did and the places I found myself in the last 6 years will be, most likely, some of the best times of my life. Coming from a low middle-class family, from a third-world country, and years later finding myself walking the streets of Tokyo with some Japanese people I met, or eating food in Georgia, the country, or staying up 24 hours long in Scandinavia because the sun never sets in the summertime. All these things are just priceless. Story number 50. I lived about an hour away from Atlanta, and wanting to learn more about my Korean heritage and the language, I decided to move to Seoul with no concrete plan in mind, with the comfort that I have extended family that are willing to help. I lived with my aunt for about a month before I was lucky enough to land a job and moved out into my own apartment a few months after that. It's been just over the 4-year mark since arriving, but I'm heading back to the States later this year. One of the immediate pros of Korea over the US is the healthcare. Holy crap, is healthcare so affordable here. I once got an MRI, an X-ray, and a CT scan all together, and it cost me just over $100. And that's without any kind of special private health insurance. Public transport is pretty cheap and extremely nice. Delivery is stupid fast and convenient since the country is relatively small. Imagine having 2-day shipping as the standard for pretty much anything and everything everything. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to really conform to Korean culture and standards. There's a huge emphasis on appearance, both physical beauty and financial, educational status, etc., which I think causes a lot of unhealthy perspectives and mindsets. People can be both really apathetic, the bystander effect, or overly affectionate, couples and PDA, in public. Also, it's probably due to cultural and personal differences, but I'm not a fan of the sense of humor here. I've also never really been into fashion, and despite looking Korean, people can tell that I'm American because of the way I dress. On the flip side, you're not likely to encounter an a-hole out in public. I've had female friends say to me that they feel pretty safe even when walking out alone at night, and you don't have to worry about having your belongings stolen out in public for the most part. I've made a few good friends here, and it sucks that I won't be able to really see them again once I leave. I'm fortunate to say I haven't had any god-awful moments, but rather an interesting story here and there. It's not perfect, but I would say I fulfilled that initial goal of learning more about the culture and language. It's been an interesting experience, but I'm glad to finally go back home after all this time. Although, I really will miss the cheap healthcare here. Story number 51. I was working dead-end jobs at a restaurant and a nightclub and bartending at events. Graduated university with 2 degrees after 7 years of study. I was debt-free with an extra $6K in the bank cause I was working 3 jobs while in school. I wanted to be a teacher, but my ex-girlfriend was negative about the idea as it wasn't going to bring in money. We broke up cause I was not enough for her and we had issues. I dated another girl from school. Broke up too due to her ex always calling and texting her behind my back, making her an emotional mess. I got SA'd after getting wasted one night after the breakup. It was someone I trusted. It was hard to face them again after that. And the day after my 28th birthday, I was depressed and hungover, and the job I really wanted had just sent me a rejection letter and didn't specify why. It was literally rock bottom for me. I told my best friend in my hometown, F it, I'm done. And I'm going to fly to another country halfway around the world to keep it anonymous. I don't want to give away the country I moved to, but I bought a ticket right then and there. On December 31st, I boarded my plane and landed in said country on New Year's Day of 2011 in heavy snow conditions. It was my first time to see real snow as it never snows where I come from. It took 6 hours by bus to get to the city I was staying at because of the heavy snow. I then explored said country for the next 3 months and personally went around going from place to place to give out my resume with no appointments and seeing if there are any jobs around. At this time, no one wanted to hire an Asian English teacher. They all wanted blonde hair, blue-eyed Caucasians. But I'm just as American as any of them since I was born and raised in the US my whole life. My first interviewer literally told me I have good credentials, but no one wants an Asian-looking English teacher. It's bad for business. Eventually, though, I got hired by a school after many interviews and countless resumes handed out. I became an English teacher at the biggest academy in the city, worked there 4 years and became a head foreign teacher. Turns out, I'm good at teaching. I even trained my new bosses as it was a meat grinder for management. 5 managers in my time. Then, embezzling of funds happened and 2 managers were stealing from foreigners' paychecks. They played innocent and even turned people against the foreign staff and proceeded to parade around the office in their opulent lifestyle, Chanel, Mercedes, etc. A whole legal mess came into play. I got fed up with all the bullcrap and lies. The school was collapsing. The management that replaced the stealing ones was no better. He was a closeted predator who gave himself classes with only middle school and high school female students and made sexual and anti-Semitic remarks during staff meetings. But during this mess, I met my wife, who was also a teacher at the same campus, but she was harassed and pushed out for whistleblowing and all the bullcrap going on. In the country we are in, you keep your head down and mind your business in the office setting, as it was the company culture, but my wife was a firebrand and ripped them a new one before quitting. I eventually quit my position as well as head foreign teacher soon after. My wife and I dated, then got married a year later after quitting the crappy school. We decided to forego our wedding plans and spend all the money we had to open our own school. We started in a small apartment and changed some of the bedrooms into classrooms. Then we became popular in the area and gave up our bedroom to make it into a 3rd classroom. We slept on the classroom floor for a year. Afterwards, we decided it was time to rent a place in a commercial building. 3 years after marrying, we finally had somewhat of an official wedding ceremony with family. 5 years later, we have won multiple awards in the education field and fostered many successful students who still come and visit our school after they graduated. I keep a box of all the thank you letters from my former students and sometimes feel like crying how they still miss us and remember me as a teacher. And the school we used to work for, it collapsed. The stealing manager continued on to try to steal our new school name after finding out my wife and I were becoming well known. She's like an effing roach. She had poached some loyal teachers from the old failed school to open her own, and 3 years later they all quit because she can't hide behind lies forever and wasn't paying her employees. Story number 52, September of 2013. I was 28, lived in Washington state my entire life, and was in a bit of a rough patch mentally. Mediocre job, living with my ex's brother, that's another story in itself, not making enough money, etc., etc. I began talking to my dad again months before that and was telling him about my troubles and concerns and the stuck feeling I've had for a bit. He suggested, albeit jokingly, to move in with him in New Jersey. I laughed it off and kept thinking about it days later. I spoke to him and asked him what it would be like if I did move. He had a diesel mechanic shop he's had for more than 20 plus years, and I could help with that. Running for parts, paperwork, phone answering, and I would get $500 a week in cash. Fast forward a few weeks, I decided to rent a storage unit and just load up as much as I could into the unit and leave with what I could fit into my Jeep. I still had 5 months left on the lease, so I willingly kept giving my roommate my portion of rent because I felt if I wasn't honoring our agreement to live together, I could at least still not leave him hanging financially for a 2-bedroom apartment by himself. He's a good guy. I was fine with it. Fast forward 6 months and I'm moving back to Washington because my dad decided to become lazy and an alcoholic again and refused to go to work while I did, and he'd stay up till 2 to 3 a.m. drinking. It was toxic, so I made the decision to come back to Washington to get rid of that. Also, not to mention, he wanted my name on the tax paperwork for his business, which was pretty shady to put it nicely. Overall, great experience to just drop my life here and go, but sad how it turned out. But I've learned a lot about me and what I would tolerate for myself in my life. Story number 53. Left my boyfriend of 2 years living in the French Quarter after years of addiction, and moved in with my narcissist grandma and mom, something I had been dreading, especially since at the time I didn't even know why they were so mean or how to deal with it. It was really hard at first. I got a job waiting tables and got on some dating sites. I was literally a shell of a person in so many ways. So many relationships with narcissists, so many drugs and bad decisions. I went on some dates and felt pretty depressed until I met this one guy who was going through his own stuff, recently divorced, and he knew how to live. He knew how to do all of the things my parents hadn't taught me to do, and I felt like magic when I looked at him. I decided I wanted to change what was making me hate myself. I quit smoking daily after 2 weeks. It took 2 years of smoking twice a month to fully quit. I went vegetarian, tried to generally have a good attitude about everything, and to avoid the self-hate talk. Both me and my now husband talked about patterns and why things happened and tried to help each other keep certain things in mind to help change habits. We still do this, and I think it's really important for us as humans to ascribe meanings to things and talk about patterns if we want to avoid getting stuck in any. The human ability to go on autopilot honestly scares me because I've been there and I don't want to go back. Finally, having such a solid network, something I'd never encountered before, was like encountering the warm hug the way drugs did initially, but this time it was real. I got really lucky. I know we both did. We ended up with each other at a vulnerable time when who knows who I might have stuck around with just to get out of living with my family. But the good news is, I knew. I wasn't the least bit unsure about him, and I never have been. Part of recovering is reconnecting and starting to listen to your gut instincts more, obviously paired with logic. Story number 54. I had been wanting to move out of my crappy area since 2008. Back then I had a rental truck set to move south, but then the economy tanked, so I pussed out. 5 years ago, I was in a really crappy spot. I was getting eviction notices constantly and couldn't afford to feed myself, dealing with a ridiculous breakup, and wasn't handling my pre-existing depression and anxiety well at all. I basically worked constantly, then came home and got super stoned and prayed I would die in my sleep. My dad got in contact with me for the first time in over 20 years, basically since I was a kid, and after a few weeks of chatting and catching up, he mentioned he had a friend who had an apartment building with a vacancy. I gave a written 1-month notice to my current place that I'd be leaving and completed my 2 weeks at my job. I traveled the 700 miles south with a car full of necessities and my dog, found a job immediately, and moved into that apartment. A few days later, we went back up north with a pickup truck to get my belongings, and my apartment was completely empty. Scratch that, they left me my vacuum that they used to clean it out. The neighbors told me they saw my stuff on the curb and wondered what had happened to me. Landlords denied that they had entered my unit, so I called the police and filed a renter's insurance claim. I lost everything I'd ever owned except some clothes and other things I packed into my 2-door sports car when I initially went down. Another few weeks later, I started getting a severe rash and itch worse than anything I'd ever experienced. My apartment down south had bed bugs. The landlord refused to take responsibility for it and blamed me. I literally didn't even have a bed or any furniture, not sure the logic there. So I broke my lease and left because it got to the point where I was sleeping in my car to avoid being bitten. I used my insurance claim money to buy a year lease at a much nicer place, but not before losing all the rest of my belongings again. I didn't want to bring anything with me because my new lease had a clause about bed bugs that said if you bring them in, they'll evict you. It wasn't worth the risk. So I've learned to live extremely minimalist. My relationship with my dad dissolved as I relearned that his love is conditional and one-sided, and we haven't spoken in years. I've also never really bonded with the locals here, and the longer I live here, the more I really dislike the general disposition of the people. But I've met some expats like me that are fantastic, and the location is beautiful. It's not my forever home, but overall, I am glad that I left where I was living. Story number 55. In 2007, I sold everything I owned and bought a one-way plane ticket to LA. Just me, my laptop, and 2 bags of clothes. I moved into a hostel to get the lay of the land, search for an apartment, and find a job. Turned into a complete party animal and nearly became homeless. Got part-time work at said hostel for a free bed. Then got part-time work at a crappy pizza place to make some cash. Eventually got the best job ever working the door at the LA Improv Comedy Club. Met hundreds of famous people and had an awesome, yet insanely dangerous, reckless, immature, and unstable lifestyle. Got sick of LA in 2 years and moved to San Diego. Worked in a hostel there as well, only this time I got my act together, eventually. Became one of the managers of the hostel and met my future wife. Saved up money and moved to Ireland 3 years later to get married. Awesome life now, great wife, good job, great place to live, great family, happily ever after. People, don't sit around. If you want to do something, don't talk about doing it. Do it. No excuses. I was dirt poor for nearly this entire story, so money isn't a stopping block. It's just an excuse. Yes, money makes things easier, but it's not the end-all be-all. Story number 56. The quick backstory is that I had watched my aunt die slowly of cirrhosis, spending all of my time between the hospital and work and sleeping for 2 months. I had been in weekly therapy for nearly 3 years. The death and the therapy combined meant I was seriously reevaluating every relationship I had with anyone and marking their responses to my needs and boundaries. And long story short, almost all of my friends had failed to be there for me in any meaningful way. And then my friend came to town with his girlfriend and kids. The last I saw him, he found out that his then-girlfriend's pregnancy wasn't his. He destroyed everything in their shared apartment so she'd have nothing he had ever paid for and got on a bus for Milwaukee. 3 years later, he's in town to visit his stepdad and stops by my house to introduce his girlfriend and baby and his child from a previous relationship when he was a teen that he had gotten custody of. In 3 years, he went from Taco Bell in a podunk town to a real family in a cool city, all by walking away. So we talked for about 90 minutes the night he was leaving, and he told me if I ever wanted to come out and stay with them, they had the room, and would appreciate the help with the kids. So, 3 weeks later, I left for Milwaukee. It was the best 7-hour drive of my life, and I truly felt like I was onto something new and exciting. Milwaukee was fantastic, so much to do, jobs available even during a recession. Ended up working overnights at an alarm monitoring call center, making calls when doors or windows opened or freezers lost temperature and occasionally calling police for scared homeowners. It was a good gig, and it paid my bills, and getting to know the 9-year-old girl was incredibly fulfilling. She didn't even care or seem to notice that I was white. And I found living with a black family to be extremely eye-opening in a way my liberal bubble wasn't expecting at all. Me and the kid would grab breakfast while everyone was still asleep. We'd go to the park because there's only 5 parks close by anywhere you stand in MKE, and I loved the architecture. I loved that they could handle the snow and ice so well that nobody even missed work. I loved that if you dropped a drink in November, it became a semi-permanent part of the sidewalk well into February. I loved that there were Renaissance fairs close by, and cheese and custard was part of the culture, and that my family was an entire day away. I really changed up there. I became someone new. I became someone super aware of his surroundings and endlessly fascinated by architecture and lights and landscaping. I was blown away by how friendly everyone was. The way standing in a Walgreens meant you were a part of a conversation between multiple customers all yelling back and forth between the aisles at each other. I dug that there was so much of the city with some strange fame to it, like the hotel and club that Dahmer frequented, the giant building that was secretly a transformer from the movies, the exceptional hilltop park that lets you see the entire city. I also loved all the water. I would often sit on benches overlooking the ocean like lakefront. I'd watch people in bodysuits try to surf the lake. I'd wander the urban areas and discover cool themed bars. I went to one of the bar rescue bars and saw Taffer walking in and out, and then got drinks there the day after it was renovated. It was really a happening place. Some forces outside of my control, and admittedly some internal crap drew me back home after a year, but it was a life-changing year, and I brought all my self-worth back with me. I didn't fall back into old friendships. I stayed alone for a while and started really observing people before allowing them into my life. I would move to a random city for 1 year if it was ever offered to me again, for sure. And I absolutely loved being an alien on a new planet for a while. Milwaukee, 9 out of 10, would try again. Story number 57. At 20, I got tired of the hometown I was in. Florida sounded nice. I had an old Ford Econoline van with seats that folded into a bed and a built-in TV. A friend's parents were selling their house, so I spent 2 weeks painting the walls, refinishing some wood floors, and pressure washing all the exterior surfaces. They paid me $1,200 for my work. With $1,200 in my pocket and everything I owned in my van with room to spare, I drove to West Palm Beach. Didn't have much of a plan. I slept in my van in parking lots on the beach, used the public showers to get clean, bought a decent-fitting suit from Goodwill, and had it professionally clean. I quickly found a job cleaning bounce houses by absolute coincidence, and it wasn't a lot of money, but it kept me from starving while I looked for other work. Living in the van worked surprisingly well. There were definitely some areas you didn't want to park, though, either because the locals would call the cops on you, or because it's hard to sleep through gunfire, looking at you, Riviera Beach. And once you find the right spots, though, you're waking up, opening your door, and looking at the ocean every morning. Eventually, I found a job working for Kaplan University in their call center. Stayed in my van for the first month or so before I got a few paychecks under my belt, and found a cheap apartment on the west side of Boca Raton. Good timing, too, because Hurricane Wilma hit about 2 months later. Overall, it's not something I could ever do today. This happened in 2002, so I'm not sure even someone as unattached as I was then could do it today. But I ended up living in Florida for 5 years before I decided to move back closer to family. It was an experience I'm glad I had. Story number 58. I was in my late teens running with a group of friends who had no motivation and just wanted to party every night. They'd been my closest friends for years. I'd been dating a gorgeous girl for over a year who also wanted to party all the time. She fit in perfectly with my group of friends. The problem was, as is often the case with young love, we were really staying together for all the wrong reasons. We were constantly hammered, and despite the earth-shaking sex, this would lead to fighting and breaking up, only to get back together a week later, primarily for makeup sex. This same pattern repeated for almost 2 years, and I was trying really hard to get through my first year of college. But my girlfriend and my group of friends just wanted to drink and smoke and get ruined every night, while I really needed to study to get through my classes. They'd get mad at me and make me feel guilty if I didn't give all my free time to them. It was hitting my grades hard. Finally, my girlfriend and I were on the phone, following another of 1,000 breakups, and talking about getting back together again, because we loved each other so much. And I was just standing there, listening to her plead with me to get back together with her, and I'll never forget this. It was like someone turned on a light switch in my head. I realized what a huge waste of time this was, that I was trying to be someone I was not, and I was trying to maintain friendships with a group of people really, who were toxic, life-sucking parasites who would never go anywhere or amount to anything. But I had ambitions and goals for my life, and I wasn't going to achieve any of this if I kept going down this path. I interrupted my girlfriend and quietly said, "I'm sorry, but I'm done with this." And I hung up the phone. When I hung up that phone, I knew I was saying goodbye to the only people I'd been really close to for the last 7 to 6 years of my life, and I was right. My whole group of friends completely ghosted me. My ex-girlfriend continued to run with my group of friends, and I was left totally alone, rebooting my life on my own terms. A year later, I met my wife. This coming August, we'll have been married for 32 years. We both completed college degrees. We have 4 great kids and 4 grandkids now, with 1 more on the way. It was the hardest decision I've ever had to make in my life, to leave all my closest friends behind that day. It meant starting my life over again, alone with no friends. Even though our relationships were pretty toxic and bound to go nowhere, I still really loved these people. But it had to happen for me to become who I was meant to be. I spent many years mentoring guys who were incarcerated in our local jail. I used the story of this experience many times to explain to these guys a pathway to sobriety and upwards mobility. And it continues to be the greatest struggle many of these guys face when they get back out. If they are released after doing their time and they immediately return to the same group of people they were with when they got thrown in the slammer, they end up just just repeating the same behaviors that put them there in the first place. If you want to make a change for the better, you have to break ties with the people who are preventing you from making those positive changes. Even if those people are your own family. Yes, it's very hard, but it has to happen if you really want to become the person who you are meant to be. Story number 59. Honestly, it didn't help much. I caught my fiance sleeping with her boss. Earlier that same day, I was offered a job 1,300 miles away, and I told them I would need time to think about it. Well, I literally called the recruiter 30 minutes after it happened and left a message saying I would take the job. I ended up sleeping at my now ex's best friend's house, let's call her Sarah, and the ex had called her for help, but Sarah was appalled and offered to let me stay with her as long as I needed, and that was probably the only good thing to come of it. The next day, I went back to my apartment, filled my truck, and then I left. The whole time my ex was bawling, begging me to stay, saying she wanted to talk about it. Well, I spent months fighting with her over apartment fees and things I took, which were all things I purchased, by the way, all while trying to settle into a new city. I was sleeping in my car for a few weeks, showering at gyms. It was bad. To make matters worse, the job was terrible. It was a standard bait and switch where the job that was described was actually nothing like the job I was expected to do. They were paying me a lot, but basically stripped all autonomy from the job. They constantly gave me the, "with what you're making, you shouldn't be complaining" line. And they also refused to pay me a relocation fee because I didn't work with corporate to actually move, whatever that meant. And they wouldn't even help me find an apartment. So that took weeks longer than it should have. It was a 2-year contract and I hated every second. I never really made many friends and didn't date much because I couldn't get past my trust issues. I was seething and angry the whole time. I had stayed friends with Sarah, and that was my only real normal relationship. Not really. Eventually, I moved back to the area, and thankfully for me, my ex had moved to another state with her then husband, and I stupidly started sleeping with Sarah and staying at her house. After 2 weeks, my trust issues and trauma with my ex poisoned the well, and I was back to sleeping in my car. I didn't date for 7 years after that. I ignored as many close relationships as possible. It took my childhood best friend's brother dying for me to reach out to him. He was still friends with a lot of our high school friends, and over time, he convinced me to move back to my hometown, and things slowly got better. I went to therapy, and it's helped, but 12 years later, I still have tremendous trust issues and anxiety. When I ran away, I felt like I was leaving everything behind. Instead, it made me feel more alone, which made me ruminate on what happened and also caused me to develop an unhealthy attachment to Sarah. My resentment towards my job, my lack of friends, and the buried hurt from my ex all percolated into controlling, possessive behavior. That's what ruined any shot I had with Sarah, which bothered me for a long time because we'd always had perfect chemistry. By now, you can see the cycle I was thrown into. If I'd confronted the issue and sought out help immediately, I don't think I would have lost nearly a decade to anger, depression, and self-pity. While I mentioned I'm still working on those things, I am a lot better now. I'm happily married, just celebrated 6 years, to a woman I trust completely. I'm starting a new career, and we're hoping to adopt in the next 5 years. So I have to say, this was one of my favorite videos that I've done in a while for Undersparked or Really Sparked. Just a lot of personal stories around relatively the same thing. And many of these stories touched my heart, and some touched my tear ducts. And a few tickled my heart. But I appreciate, again, all the people just being vulnerable and sharing these experiences for overlapping in different reasons, and just seeing the reasoning behind why people do these things. And also saying, like, hey, sometimes this stuff sucks. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it took a decade for it to work out for me. But anyway, guys, we are at the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching, commenting. Have a really good day. And